Part 2, Chapter 9 of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Mary Rhodey. Part 2, The Woman in the Case. Chapter 9, The Tocsin Story. La Salle, the old French name, that old French inscription on the ring, Sonnez le Tocsin. Yes, he began to understand now. She was Marie LaSalle. He began to remember more clearly. Marie LaSalle. They had said she was one of the most beautiful girls who had ever made her entree into New York society. But he had never met her as Marie LaSalle, never met her until now as the Tocsin, in this bare, destitute, squalid hovel, here at bay both of them for their lives. He had been away when she had come with her father to New York, and on his return there had only been the father's brother in the father's place, and she was gone. He remembered the furor her disappearance had caused, the enormous rewards her uncle had offered in an effort to trace her, the 1,001 speculations as to what had become of her, and that then, gradually, as even the most startling and mystifying of events and happenings always do, the affair had dropped into oblivion, and had been forgotten by the public at least. He began to count back. Yes, it must have been nearly 5 years ago, 2 years before she, as the Tocsin, and he, as the Gray Seal, had formed their amazing and singular partnership, that— He started suddenly as she spoke. "I want to tell you in as few words as I can," she said abruptly, breaking the silence. "Listen, then, Jimmie. My mother died 10 years ago. I was little more than a child then. Shortly after her death father made a business trip to New York, and on the advice of some supposed friends, he had a new will drawn up by a lawyer whom they recommended, and to whom they introduced him. I do not know who those men were. The lawyer's name was Travers, Hilton Travers." She glanced curiously at Jimmie Dale and added quickly, "He was the chauffeur, the man who was killed last night." "You mean," Jimmie Dale burst out, "you mean that he was— But first, the will. What was in the will?" "It was a very simple will," she answered, "and from the nature of it, it was not at all strange that my father should have been willing to have it drawn up by a comparative stranger, if that's what you are thinking. Summarized in a few words, the will left everything to me, and appointed my Uncle Henry as my guardian and the sole executor of the estate until I should have reached my 25th birthday. It provided for a certain sum each year to be paid to my uncle for his services as executor, and at the expiration of the trust period, that is, when I was 25, bequeathed to him the sum of $100,000. Jimmie Dale nodded. "Go on," he prompted. "It is hard to tell it in logical sequence," she said, hesitating a moment. "So many things seem to overlap each other. You must understand a little more about Hilton Travers. During the 5 years following the signing of the will, father came frequently to New York, and became not only intimate with Travers, but so much impressed with the other's cleverness and ability that he kept putting more and more of his business into Travers' hands. At the end of that 5 years, we moved to New York, and father, who was then quite an old man, retired from all active business and turned over a great many of his personal affairs to Travers to look after for him, giving Travers power of attorney in a number of instances. So much for Travers. Now, about my uncle. He was my father's only brother. In fact, they were the only surviving members of their family, apart from very distant connections in France, from where, generations back, the family originally came. Her hand touched Jimmie Dale's for an instant. That ring, Jimmie, with its crest and inscription, is the old family coat of arms." "Yes," he said briefly, "I surmised as much." "Strange as it may seem, in view of the fact that they had not seen each other for 20 years," she went on hurriedly, "my father and my uncle were more than ordinarily attached to each other. Letters passed regularly between them, and there was constant talk of one paying the other a visit. But the visit never materialized. My uncle was somewhere in Australia, my father was here, and consequently I never saw my uncle. He was quite a different type of man from father, more restless, less settled, more rough and ready, preferring the outdoor life of the Australian bush to the restrictions of any so-called civilization, I imagine. Financially, I do not think he ever succeeded very well, for twice, in one way or another, he lost every sheep on his ranch and father set him up again. And I do not think he could ever have had much of a ranch, for I remember once in one of the letters he wrote that he said he had not seen a white man in weeks, so he must have lived a very lonely life. Indeed, at about the time father drew the new will, my uncle wrote saying that he had decided to give up sheep running on his own account, as it did not pay, and to accept a very favorable offer that had been made to him to manage a ranch in New Zealand. And his next letter was from the latter country, stating that he had carried out his intentions and was well satisfied with the change he had made. The long-proposed visit still continued to occupy my father's thoughts, and on his retirement from business he definitely made up his mind to go out to New Zealand, taking me with him. In fact, the plans were all arranged. My uncle expressed unbounded delight in his letters, and we were practically on the eve of sailing when a cable came from my uncle telling us to postpone the visit for a few months, as he was obliged to make a buying trip for his new employer that would keep him away that length of time. And then, her fingers that had been abstractedly picking out the lines formed by the grain of the wood in the tabletop closed suddenly into tight clenched fists, and then my father died. Jimmie Dale turned away his head. There were tears in her eyes. The old sense of unreality was strong upon him again. He was listening to the Tocsin's story. It was strange that he should be doing that it could be really so. It seemed as though magically he had been transported out of the world where for years past he had lived, with danger lurking at every turn, where men set watch about his house to trap him, where the denizens of the underworld yowled like starving beasts to sink their fangs in him, where the police were ceaselessly upon his trail to wreak an insensate vengeance upon him. It seemed as though he had been transported away from all that to something that he had dreamed might perhaps sometime happen, and that he had hoped might happen, that he had longed for always, but now that it was his, that it also was full of the sense of the unreal. And yet, as his mind followed the thread of her story, and leaped ahead and vaguely glimpsed what was to come, he was conscious in a sort of premonitory way of a vaster peril than any he had ever known, as though forces, for the moment masked, were arrayed against him whose strength and whose malignity were beyond human parallel. In what a strange, almost incoherent way his brain was working. He roused himself a little and looked around him, and, with a shock, the starkness of the room, the abject, pitiful air of destitution brought home to him with terrific, startling force the significance of the scene in which he was playing a part. His face set suddenly in hard lines. That she should have been brought to assume such a life as this, forced out of her environment of wealth and refinement, forced in her purity to rub shoulders with the vile, the dissolute, forced to exist as such a creature amid the crime and vice, the wretched horror of the underworld that swirled around her. There was anger now upon him, burning hot, a merciless craving that was a savage, hungry lust for vengeance. And then she was speaking again. Father's death occurred very shortly after my uncle's message advising us to postpone our trip was received. On his death, Travers, very naturally as father's lawyer, cabled my uncle to come to New York at once, and my uncle replied, saying that he was coming by the first steamer. She paused again, but only for an instant, as though to frame her thoughts in words. I have told you that I had never seen my uncle, that even my father had not seen him for 20 years, and I have told you that the man you know as Henry LaSalle is an impostor. I am using the word uncle now when I refer to him simply to avoid confusion. You are perhaps expecting me to say that I took a distinctive dislike to him from the moment he arrived. On the contrary, I had every reason to be predisposed toward him, and indeed was rather agreeably surprised than otherwise. He was not nearly so uncouth and unpolished as somehow I had pictured his life would have made him. Do you understand, Jimmie? He was kind, sympathetic, and in an apathetic way I liked him. I say apathetic because I think that best describes my own attitude toward everyone and everything following father's death until that night. She rose abruptly from her chair as though a passive position of any kind had suddenly become intolerable. "Why tell you what my father and I were to each other?" she cried out in a low, passionate voice. It seemed as though everything that meant anything had gone out of my life. I became worn out, nervous, and though the days were bad enough, the nights were a source of dread. I began to suffer from insomnia. I could not sleep. This was even before my supposed uncle came. I used to read for hours and hours in my room after I had gone to bed, but she flung out her hand with an impatient gesture. There is no need to dwell on that. One night, about a week after that man had arrived, and a little over a month after father had died, I was in my room and had finished a book I was reading. I remember that it was well after midnight. I had not the slightest inclination to sleep. I picked up another book, and after that another. There were plenty in my room. But irrationally, of course, none pleased me. I decided to go down to the library, not that I think I really expected to find anything that I actually wanted, but more because it was an impulse, and furnished me for the moment with some definite objective, something to do. I got up, slipped on a dressing gown, and went downstairs. The lights were all out. I was just on the point of switching on those in the reception hall, when suddenly it seemed as though I had not strength to lift my hand, and I remembered that for an instant I grew terribly cold with dread and fear. From the room on my right a voice had reached me. The door was closed, but the voice was raised in an outburst of profanity. I could hear every word. "If she's out of the way, there's no comeback," the voice snarled. "I won't listen to anything else, do you hear? Why, you fool, what are you trying to do? Hand me one? Turn everything into cash, and divvy, and beat it, eh? And I'm the goat, and I get caught and get 20 years for stealing trust funds, and the rest of you get the coin?" He swore terribly again. "Who's taken the risk in this for the last 5 years? There'll be no smart-aleck lawyer tricks. There'll be no halfway measures. And who are you to dictate? She goes out. That's safe. I inherit as next of kin with no one to dispute it, and that's all there is to it." I stood there and could not move. It was the voice of the man I knew as my uncle. My heart seemed to have stopped beating. I tried to tell myself that I was dreaming, that it was too horrible, too incredible to be real, that they could not really mean to murder me. and then I recognized Hilton Travers' voice. "I am not dictating, and you are not serious, of course," he said with what seemed an uneasy laugh. "I am only warning you that you are forgetting to take the real Henry LaSalle into account. He is bound to hear of this eventually, and then—" Another voice broke in, one I did not recognize. "You're talking too loud, both of you. Travers doesn't understand, but he's to be wised up tonight, according to orders, and—" The voice became inaudible, muffled. I could not hear any more. I suppose I remained there another 3 or 4 minutes, too stunned to know what to do. And then I ran softly along the hall to the library door. The library, you understand, was at the rear of the room they were in, and the 2 rooms were really one. That is, there was only an archway between them. I cannot tell you what my emotions were. I do not know. I only know that I kept repeating to myself, "They are going to kill me, they are going to kill me," and that it seemed I must try and find out everything I could. She turned away from the table and began to pace nervously up and down the miserable room. Jimmie Dale rose impulsively from his chair, but she waved him back again. "No, wait," she said. "Let me finish. I crept into the library. It took me a long time because I had to be so careful not to make the slightest noise. I suppose it was fully 6 or 7 minutes from the time I had first heard my supposed uncle's voice until I had crept far enough forward to be able to see into the room beyond. There were 3 men there. The man I knew as my uncle was sitting at one end of the table. Another had his back toward me, and Travers was facing in my direction. And I think I never saw so ghastly a face as was Hilton Travers then. He was standing up, sort of swaying, as he leaned with both hands on the table. "Now then, Travers," the man whose back was turned to me was saying threateningly, "you've got the story now. Sign those papers." It seemed as though Travers could not speak for a moment. He kept looking wildly from one to the other. He was white to the lips. "You've let me in for this?" he said hoarsely at last. "You devils! You devils! You devils! You've let me in for murder! Both of them, both Peter and his brother, murdered!" She stopped abruptly before Jimmie Dale and clutched his arm tightly. "Jimmie, I don't know why I did not scream out. Everything went black for a moment before my eyes. It was the first suspicion I had had that my father had met with foul play, and I—" But now Jimmie Dale swayed up from his chair. "Murdered!" he exclaimed tensely. "Your father! But I remember perfectly. There was no hint of any such thing at the time, and never has been since. He died from quite natural causes." She looked at him strangely. "He died from inoculation," she said. Did you not see something of that laboratory in the Crime Club yourself the night before last? Enough to understand?" "Good God!" muttered Jimmie Dale, in a startled way then. Go on. What happened then?" She passed her hand a little wearily across her eyes and sank down into her chair again. "Travers," she continued, picking up the thread of her story, "had raised his voice, and the 3rd man at the table leaned suddenly, aggressively toward him. 'Hold your tongue!' he growled furiously. 'All you're asked to do is sign the papers, not talk.'" Travers shook his head. "I won't!" he cried out. "I won't have any hand in another murder, in hers. My God, I won't, I tell you. It's horrible." "Look here, you fool," the man who was posing as my uncle broke in then. "You're in this too deep to get out now. If you know what's good for you, you'll do as you're told." Jimmie, I shall never forget Travers' face. It seemed to have changed from white to gray, and there was horror in his eyes. and then he seemed to lose all control of himself, shaking his fists in their faces, cursing them in utter abandon. "I'm bad," he cried. "I've gone everything but the limit, everything but murder. I stop there. I'll have no more to do with this. I'm through. You pulled me into this, and I didn't know." "Well, you know now," the third man sneered. "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to see that no harm comes to Marie LaSalle," Travers answered in a dull way. The other man now was on his feet, and I do not know quite how to express it, Jimmie. He seemed ominously quiet in both his voice and his movements. "You'd better think that over again, Travers," he said. "Do you mean it?" "I mean it," Travers said. "I mean it, God help me." "You may well at that," returned the other with an ugly laugh. He reached out his hand toward the telephone on the table. "Do you know what will happen to you if I telephone a certain number and say that you have turned traitor?" "I'll have to take my chances," Travers replied doggedly. "I'm through." "Take them, then," flung out the other. "You'll have little time given you to do us any harm." Travers did not answer. I think he almost expected an attack upon him then from the two men. He hesitated a moment, then backed slowly toward the door. What happened in the next few moments in that room I do not know. I stole out of the library. I was obsessed with the thought that I must see Travers, see him at all costs before he got away from the house. I reached the end of the hall as the room door opened and he came out. It was dark, as I said, and I could not see distinctly, but I could make out his form. He closed the door behind him, and then I called his name in a whisper. He took a quick step toward me, then turned and hurried toward the front door, and I thought he was going away. But the next instant I understood his ruse. He opened the front door, shut it again quite loudly, and crept back to me. "Take me somewhere where we will be safe, quick," he whispered. There was only one place where I was sure we would be safe. I led him to the rear of the house and up the servants' stairs and to my boudoir. She broke off abruptly and once more rose from her chair, and once more began to pace the room. Back in his chair, Jimmie Dale, tense and motionless now, watched her without a word. "It would take too long to tell you all that passed between us," she went on hurriedly. "The man was frankly a criminal, but not to the extent of murder, and in that respect at least he was honest with himself. Almost the first words he said to me were, 'Miss LaSalle, I am as good as a dead man if I am caught by the devils behind those two men downstairs.' And then he began to plead with me to make my own escape. He did not know who the man was that was posing as my uncle, had never seen him before until he presented himself as Henry LaSalle. The other man he knew as Clark, but knew also that Clark was merely an assumed name. He had fallen in with Clark almost from the time that he had begun to practice his profession, and at Clark's instigation had gone from one crooked deal to another, and had made a great deal of money. He knew that behind Clark was a powerful, daring, and unscrupulous band of criminals, organized on a gigantic scale, of which he himself was, in a sense, a probationary sense as he put it, a member. But he had never come into direct contact with them. He had received all his orders and instructions through Clark. He had been told by Clark that he was to cultivate Father following the introduction, to win Father's confidence, to get as many of Father's affairs into his hands as possible, to reach the position, in fact, of becoming Father's recognized attorney, and all this with the object, as he supposed, of embezzling from Father on a large scale. Then Father died, and Travers was instructed to cable my uncle. He knew that the man who answered that summons was an impostor, but he did not know until he had admitted it to him that night that both my father and my uncle had been murdered, and that I too was to be made away with. She looked at Jimmie Dale and suddenly laughed out bitterly. "No, you don't understand even yet the patient, ingenious deviltry of those fiends. It was they, at the time the new will was drawn, who offered to buy out my real uncle's sheep ranch in that lonely, unsettled district in Australia, and offered him that new position in New Zealand. My uncle never reached New Zealand. He was murdered on his way there, and in his place, assuming his name, appeared the man who has been posing as my uncle ever since. Do you begin to see? For 5 years they were patiently working out their plans. For 5 years before my father's death that man lived and became known and accepted and established himself as Henry LaSalle. Do you see now why he cabled us to postpone our visit? He ran very little risk. The chances were 1 in 1,000 that any of his few acquaintances in Australia would ever run across him in New Zealand. And besides, he was chosen because it seems there was a slight resemblance between him and the real Henry LaSalle, enough, with his changed mode of living and more elaborate and pretentious surroundings, to have enabled him to carry through a bluff had it become necessary. He had all of my uncle's papers, and the Crime Club furnished him with every detail of our lives here. I forgot to say, too, that from the moment my uncle was supposed to have reached New Zealand, all his letters were typewritten, and evidence in father's eyes that his brother had secured a position of some importance, as, indeed, from apparently unprejudiced sources, they took pains to assure father, was a fact. This left them with only my uncle's signature to forge to the letters, not a difficult matter for them. Believing that they had Travers so deeply implicated that he could do nothing, even if he had the inclination, which they had not for a moment imagined, and arrogant in the belief in their own power to put him out of the way in any case if he proved refractory, they admitted all this to him that night when he brought up the issue of the real Henry LaSalle putting in an appearance sooner or later, and when they wanted him to smooth their path by releasing all documents where his power of attorney was involved. Do you see now the part they gave Travers to play? It was to put the stamp of genuineness upon the false Henry LaSalle. Not but that they were prepared, with what would appear to be overwhelmingly convincing evidence, to prove it if it were necessary. But if the man were accepted by the estate's lawyer, there was little chance of anyone else questioning his identity. She halted again by the table, and forced a smile as her eyes met Jimmie Dale's. "I'm almost through, Jimmie. That night was a terrible one for both of us. Travers' life was not worth a moment's purchase once they found him, and mine was only under reprieve until sufficient time to obviate suspicion should have elapsed after father's death. We had no proof that would stand in any court, even if we should have been given the chance to adopt that course. And without absolute, irrefutable proof, it was all so cleverly woven, stretched over so many years, that our charge must have been held to be too visionary and fantastic to have any basis in fact. All Travers would have been able to advance was the statement that the supposed Henry LaSalle had admitted being an impostor and a murderer to him. Who would believe it? On the face of it, it appeared to be an absurdity, and even granted that we were given an opportunity to bring the charge, they would be able to prove by 100 influential and well-known men in New Zealand that the impostor was really Henry LaSalle, and were we able to find any of my uncle's old acquaintances in Australia, it would be necessary to get them here, and not one of them would have reached America alive. But there was not a chance, Jimmie, of doing that. They would have killed Travers the moment he showed himself in the open. The only thing we could do that night was to try and save our own lives. The only thing we could look forward to was acquiring in some way, unknown to them, the proof, fully established, with which we could crush them in a single stroke, and before they would have time to strike back. The vital thing was proof of my uncle's death. That, if it could be obtained at all, could only be obtained in Australia. Travers was obliged to go somewhere, to disappear from that moment if he wanted to save his life, and he volunteered to go out there. He left the house that night by the back entrance in an old servant's suit, which I found for him, and I never heard from him again until a month ago in the personal column of the Morning News Argus, through which we had agreed to communicate. As for myself, I left the house the next morning, telling my pseudo-uncle that I was going to spend a few days with a friend, and this I actually did, but in those few days I managed to turn all my own securities, that had been left me by my mother and which amounted to a considerable sum, into cash. And then, Jimmie, I came to this. I have lived like this, and in different disguises, as a settlement worker, as a widow of means in a fashionable uptown apartment, but mostly as you see me now, for 5 years. For 5 years I have watched my supposed uncle, hoping, praying that through him I could get to know the others associated with him, hoping, praying that Travers would succeed, hoping, praying that we would get them all, and watching day after day and year after year the personal column of the paper, until at last I began to be afraid that it was all useless. And there was nothing, Jimmie, nothing anywhere, and I had no success. Her voice was choked a little. Nothing. Even Clark never went again to the house. You can understand now how I came to know the strange things that I wrote to the Gray Seal, how the life that I have led, how this life here in the underworld, how the constant search for some clue on my own account brought them to my knowledge. And you can understand now, too, why I never dared to let you meet me, for I knew well enough that while I worked to undermine my father's and my uncle's murderers, they were moving heaven and earth to find me. That is all, Jimmie. The day before yesterday, a month after Travers' first message to let me know that he was coming, there was another personal, giving me an hour and a telephone number. He was back. He had everything, everything. We dared not meet. He was afraid, suspicious that they had got track of him again. You know the rest. That package contained the proof that with Travers' death can probably never be obtained again. Do you understand why they want it? Why it is life and death to me? Do you understand why my supposed uncle offered huge rewards for me? Why secretly every resource of that hideous organization has been employed to find me? That it is only by my death the estate can pass into their hands. And now... She flung out her hand suddenly toward Jimmie Dale. "Oh, Jimmie, Jimmie, I've fought so long, alone. Jimmie, what are we to do?" He came slowly to his feet. She had fought so long, alone, but now it was his turn to fight, for her. But how? She had not told him all. Surely she had not told him all, for everything depended upon that package. There had been so much to tell that she had not thought of all, and she had not told him the details about that. "That box, number 428, he cried quickly. "What is that? What does it mean?" She shook her head. "I do not know," she answered. "Then who is this John Johansson?" "I do not know," she said again. "Know where the Crime Club is?" "No," dully. He stared at her for a moment in a dazed way. "My God!" Jimmie Dale murmured. And then she turned away her head. It's pretty bad, isn't it, Jimmie? I told you that we did not hold many trumps." End of Part 2, Chapter 9. Part 2, Chapter 10 of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Mary Rohde. Part 2, The Woman in the Case. Chapter 10, Silver Mag. There was silence between them. Minute after minute passed. Neither spoke. Jimmie Dale dropped back into his chair again and stared abstractedly before him. "We do not hold many trumps, Jimmie. We do not hold many trumps." Her words were repeating themselves over and over in his mind. They seemed to challenge him mockingly to deny what was so obviously a fact, and because he could not deny it, to taunt, to jeer at him, when all that was held at stake hung literally upon his next move. He looked up mechanically as the Tocsin walked to a broken mirror at the rear of the miserable room, nodded mechanically in approval as she began deftly to retouch the make-up on her face where the tears had left their traces, and resumed his abstracted gaze before him. Box number 428, John Johansson, the Crime Club, the identity of the man who was posing as Henry LaSalle. If only he could hit upon a clue to the solution of a single one of those things, or a single phase of one of them, if only he could glimpse a ray of light that would at least prompt action when every moment of inaction was multiplying the odds against them. There were the men who were watching his house at that moment on Riverside Drive. He, as Larry the Bat, might in turn keep watch on them. He had thought of that. In time, perhaps he might, by so doing, discover the whereabouts of the Crime Club. In time, it was just that he had no time. 48 hours, the Tocsin insisted, was all the time that he could count upon before they would become suspicious of Jimmie Dale's illness, before they would discover that they were watching an empty house. He might, though this was even more hazardous, make an attempt to trace the wires that tapped those of his telephone through the basement window that gave on the garage driveway. And what then? True, they could not lead very far away, but even if successful, what then? They would not lead him to the Crime Club, but simply to some confederate, to some man or woman playing the part of a servant perhaps in the house next door, who in turn would have to be shadowed and watched. Jimmie Dale shook his head. Better, of the two, to start in at once and shadow those who were shadowing his house. But that was not the way. He knew that intuitively. He hated to eliminate it from consideration, for he had no other move to take its place. But such a move was almost suicide in itself. Time, and time alone, was the vital factor. They, the Tocsin and he, must act quickly, and strike that night if they were to win. His fingers, the grimy fingers, dirty nailed, of Larry the Bat, that none now would recognize as the slim, tapering, wonderfully sensitive fingers of Jimmie Dale, the fingers that had made the name of the Gray Seal famous, whose tips mocked at bars and safes and locks, and seemed to embody in themselves all the human senses, tightened spasmodically on the edge of the table. Time, time, time! It seemed to din in his ears. And while he sat there powerless, impotent, the Crime Club was moving heaven and earth to find what he must find, that package, if he was to save this woman here, the woman whom he loved, she who had been forced, through the machinations of these hell fiends, to adopt the life of a wretched hag, to exist among the dregs of the underworld, whose squalor and vice and wantonness none knew better than he. Jimmie Dale's face set grimly. Somewhere in the past 5 years of this life of hers in which she had been fighting the Crime Club, pitting that clever brain of hers against it, must lie a clue. She had told him her story only in baldest outline, with scarcely a reference to her own personal acts, with barely a single detail. There must be something that perhaps she had overlooked, something, just the merest hint of something that would supply a starting point, give him a glimmer of light. She came back from across the room and sank down in her chair again. She did not speak. The question that meant life and death to them both was in her eyes. Jimmie answered the mute interrogation tersely. "Not yet," he said. Then, almost curtly, in a quick, incisive way, as the keen, alert brain began to delve and probe, "You say this man Clark never returned to the house after that night?" She nodded her head quietly. "You are sure of that?" he insisted. "Yes," she said, "I am sure." "And you say that all these years you have kept a watch on the man who is posing as your uncle, and that he never went anywhere or associated with anyone that would afford you a clue to this crime club?" "Yes," she said again. It was a moment before Jimmie Dale spoke. "It's very strange," he said musingly at last. "So strange, in fact, that it's impossible. He must have communicated with the others, and communicated with them often. The game they were playing was too big, too full of details to admit of any other possibility, and the telephone as an explanation isn't good enough. And yet," she said earnestly, "possible or impossible, it is nevertheless true. That he might have succeeded in eluding me on occasions was perhaps to be expected, but that in all those years I should not catch him once, in what, if you are correct, must have been many and repeated conferences with the same men, is too improbable to be thought of seriously." Jimmie Dale shook his head again. "If you had been able to watch him night and day, that might be so," he said crisply, "but at best you could only watch him a very small portion of the time." She smiled at him a little wanly. "Do you think, Jimmie, from what you, as the Gray Seal, know of me, that I would have watched in any haphazard way like that?" He glanced at her with a sudden start. "What do you mean?" he asked quickly. "Look at me," she said quietly. "Have you ever seen me before? I mean, as I am now?" "No," he answered after an instant. "Not that I know of." "And yet," she smiled wanly again, "you have not lived, or made the place you hold in the underworld, without having heard of Silver Mag?" "You!" exclaimed Jimmie Dale. "You, Silver Mag?" He stared at her wonderingly, as, crouch-shouldered now, the hair, gray-threaded, straggling out from under the hood of a faded, dark-blue, seam-worn cloak, she sat before him, a typical creature of the underworld, her role an art in its conception, perfect in its execution. Silver Mag! Yes, he had heard of Silver Mag, as everyone in the Bad Lands had heard of her. Silver Mag and her pocketful of coin. Always a pocketful of silver, so they said, that was dispensed prodigally to the wives and children temporarily deprived of support by husbands and fathers unfortunate enough in their clashes with the law to be doing spaces up the river, and therefore the underworld swore by Silver Mag. Always silver, never a bill. Silver Mag had never been seen with a banknote. That was her eccentricity. Much or little, she gave or paid out of her pocket full of jangling silver. She was credited with being a sworn enemy of the police, and, yes, he remembered, too, with having done time herself. "I don't quite understand," he said, in a puzzled way. "I haven't run across you personally because you probably took care to see that I shouldn't, but it's no secret, everyone says you've served a jail sentence yourself." "That is simply enough explained," she answered gravely. "The story is of my own making. When I decided to adopt this life, both for my own safety and as the best means of keeping a watch on that man, I knew that I must win the confidence of the underworld, that I must have help, and that in order to obtain that help I must have some excuse for my enmity against the man known as Henry LaSalle. To be widely known in the underworld was of inestimable value. Nothing, I knew, could accomplish that as quickly as eccentricity. You see now how and why I became known as Silver Mag. I gained the confidence of every crook in New York through their wives and children. I told them the story of my jail sentence, while I swore vengeance on Henry LaSalle. I told them that he had had me arrested for something I never stole while I was working for him as a charwoman, and that he had me railroaded to jail. There wasn't one but gave me credit for the theft, perhaps, but equally there wasn't one but understood, and my eccentricity helped this out, my wanting to get Henry LaSalle. Well, do you see now, Jimmie? I had money, I had the confidence of the underworld, I had an excuse for my hatred for Henry LaSalle, and so I had all the help I wanted. Day and night that man has been watched. He receives no visitors. What social life he has is, as you know, at the club. There is not a house that he has ever entered that sooner or later I have not entered after him in the hope of finding the headquarters of the clique. Even the men and women, as far as human possibility could accomplish it, that he has talked to on the streets have been shadowed and their identity satisfactorily established, and the net result has been failure, utter, absolute, complete failure. Jimmie Dale's eyes, that had held steadily on her face, shifted, troubled and perplexed, to the tabletop. "You are wonderful," he said under his breath. "Wonderful. And that makes it all the more amazing, all the more incomprehensible. It is still impossible that he has not been in close and constant touch with his accomplices. He must have been. We would be blind fools to argue against it. It could not, on the face of it, have been otherwise." "Then how, when, where has he done it?" she asked wearily. "God knows," he said bitterly, "and if they have been clever enough to escape you all these years, I'm almost inclined to say what you said a little while ago, that we're beaten." She watched him miserably as he pushed back his chair impulsively, and standing up stared down at her. "We're against it, hard," he said with a mirthless laugh. Then, his lips tightening, "But we'll try another tack. The chauffeur, Travers. Though even here the Crime Club has a day's start of us, even if last night they knew no more about the whereabouts of that package than we know now. I'm afraid of it. The chances are more than even that they've already got it. If they were able to catch Travers as the chauffeur, they would have had something tangible to work back from." Jimmie Dale was talking more to himself than to the Tocsin now, as though he were muttering his thoughts aloud. "How did they get track of him? When? Where? What has it led to? And what in heaven's name," he burst out suddenly, "is this box number 428? "A safety deposit vault, perhaps, that he has taken somewhere," she hazarded. Jimmie Dale laughed mirthlessly again. "That is the one definite thing I do know, that it isn't," he said positively. "It is nothing of that kind. It was 10:30 at night when I met him, and he said he had intended going back for the package if it had been safe to do so. Deposit vaults are not open at that hour. The package is, or was, if they have not already got it, readily accessible, and at any hour. Now go over everything again, every detail that passed between you and Travers. He let you know that he was back in New York by means of a personal, you said. What else was in that personal besides the telephone number and the hour you were to call him? Anything?" "Nothing that will us any," she replied colorlessly. "There were simply the words, 'Northeast corner of 6th Avenue and Waverly Place,' and the signature that we had agreed upon, the 2 first and 2 last letters of the alphabet transposed. B-A-Z-Y. I see, said Jimmie Dale quickly, and over the phone he completed his message? Clever enough. Yes, she said. In that way, if anyone were listening or overheard the plan, there could be little harm come of it, for the essential feature of all, the place of rendezvous, was not mentioned. It has not been Travers' fault that this happened, and in spite of every precaution it has cost him his life. He wanted nothing to give them a clue to my whereabouts. He was trying to guard against the slightest evidence that would associate us one with the other. He even warned me over the phone not to tell him how, where, or the mode of life I was living, and naturally he dared give me no particulars about himself. I was simply to select a third party whom I could trust, and to follow out his instructions, which were those that I sent to you in my letter. Jimmie Dale began to pace nervously up and down the room. Nothing else? He queried a little blankly. Nothing else, she said monotonously. But since last night, since you knew that things had gone wrong, he persisted, surely you traced that telephone number, the one you called up. Yes, she said, and shrugged her shoulders in a tired way. Naturally I did that, but, like everything else, it amounted to nothing. He telephoned from Makoff's pawn shop on that alley off Thompson Street, and— Where? Jimmie Dale, suddenly stock still, almost shouted the word. He telephoned from where? Say that again. She looked at him in amazement, half rising from her chair. Jimmie, what is it? She cried. You don't mean that— He was beside her now, his hands pressed upon her shoulders, his face flushed. Box number 428. He laughed out hysterically in his excitement. John Johansson, box number 428. And like a fool I never thought of it. Don't you see? Don't you know now yourself? The underground post office. She stood up, clinging to him, a wild relief that was based on her confidence in him, in her eyes and face, even while she shook her head. No, she said frantically, no, I do not know. Tell me, Jimmie, tell me quickly. You mean the Makoffs? No, not Makoff's. At Spider Jack's, on Thompson Street. He was clipping off his words, still holding her tightly by the shoulders, still staring into her eyes. You know Spider Jack? Jack's little novelty store? Ah, you have not learned all of the underworld yet. Spider Jack is the craftiest fence in the Badlands, and Makoff is his partner. Spider buys the crook stuff, and Makoff disposes of it through the pawnshop. It's only a step through the connecting backyard from one to the other, and— Yes, but, she interrupted feverishly, the package, you said— Wait, Jimmie Dale cried, I'm coming to that. If Travers stood in with Makoff, he stood in with Spider Jack. For years Spider has been a sort of clearinghouse for the underworld. For years he has conducted, and profitably too, his underground post office. Crooks from all over the country, let alone those in New York, communicate with each other through Spider Jack. These for a fee are registered at Spider's and given a number, a box number he calls it, though of course there are no actual boxes. Letters come by mail addressed to him, the sealed envelope within containing the actually intended recipient's name. These Spider either forwards or delivers in person when they are called for. Dozens of crooks, too, unwilling perhaps to dispose of small ill-gotten articles at ruinous fence prices, and finding it unhealthy for the moment to keep them in their possession, use this means of depositing them temporarily for safe-keeping. You see now, don't you? It's certain that's where Travers left the package. He used the name of John Johansson, not to hoodwink Spider Jack, I should say, but as an added safeguard against the crime club. Travers must have known both Makoff and Spider Jack in the old days, and probably had reason, and good reason, to trust them both. Possibly a crook then himself, as he confessed, he may have acted in a legal capacity for them in their frequent tangles with the police. Then, she said, and there was a glad, new note in her voice, Then, Jimmie, we are safe. You can get it, Jimmie. It is only a little thing for the Gray Seal to do, to get it now that we know where it is." "Yes," he said tersely. "Yes, if it is still there." "Still there," she repeated the words quickly, nervously. "Still there? What do you mean?" "I mean, if they too have not discovered that he was at Makoff's, if they have not got there first," he said grimly. "There seems to be no limit to their cleverness or their power. They penetrated his disguise as a chauffeur, and who knows what more they have learned since last night. We are fighting them in the dark, and— "What's that?" he whispered tensely, suddenly, and leaning forward like a flash, as he whipped his automatic from his pocket, he blew out the lamp. The room was in darkness. They stood there rigid, silent, listening. Her hand found and caught his arm. And then it came again, a low sound, the sound of a stealthy footstep just outside the window that faced on the storage yard. End of Part 2, Chapter 10.
Part 2, Chapter 11 of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Lars Rolander. Part 2. The Woman in the Case. Chapter 11. The Magpie. A minute passed. Another. The automatic at Jimmie Dale's hip, the muzzle just peeping over the tabletop, held a steady bead on the window. Came the footstep again, and then suddenly a series of low, quick tappings upon the window pane. The Tocsin's hand slipped away from his arm. Jimmie Dale's set face relaxed as he read the underground Morse, and he replaced his revolver slowly in his pocket. "The Magpie," said Jimmie Dale in an undertone. "What's he want?" "I don't know," she answered in a whisper. "He never came here before. There's a back way out, Jimmie, if you—" "No," he said quickly. "We've enemies enough without making one of the Magpie. He knows someone is here with you. Our shadows were on the blind. Don't queer yourself. Let him in. I'll light the lamp." He struck a match as she ran from the room, and, lifting the hot lamp chimney with the edge of his ragged coat, lighted the lamp. He turned the wick down a little, shading and dimming the room, and then, as he flirted a bead of moisture from his forehead, whimsically stretched out his hand to watch it in the lamplight. "That's bad, Jimmie," he muttered gravely to himself, as he noted an almost imperceptible tremor. "Got a start, didn't you? Under a bit of strain, eh? Well," grimly, "never mind. It looks as though the luck had turned Makoff and Spider Jack." His hand reached up to his hat, jerked the brim at a rakish angle over his eyes, and he sprawled himself out on a chair. He heard the Tocsin's voice at the front door, and a man's voice, low and guarded, answer her. Then the door closed, and their steps approached the room. It was rather curious that a visit from the Magpie. What could the Magpie want? What could there be in common between the Magpie and Silver Mag? The Magpie, alias Slimmy Joe, was counted the cleverest safe worker in the United States, bearing only and always one. A smile flickered across the lips of Larry the Bat, one whose preeminence the Magpie, much to his own chagrin, admitted himself, the Gray Seal. He looked up, twisting the stub of a cigarette between his grimy fingers and fumbling for a match, as the Tocsin, and behind her the Magpie, short, slim and wiry, shrewd-faced, with sharp, quick-glancing little black eyes, entered the room. "Hello, Larry," grinned the Magpie. "Got your breath back yet? I felt it through the window pane when yours let go at the lamp." "Hello, Slimmy," returned Jimmie Dale ungraciously, speaking through the corner of his mouth.
Forget it."
"Sure," said the Magpie unconcernedly. He stared about him, and finally, drawing a chair up to the table, sat down, motioned the Tocsin to do the same, and leaned forward amiably. "I didn't mean to throw no scare into youse," he said in a conciliating tone, "but I had a little business with Mag, and I was kind of interested in whether she was entertainin' company or not, see? I didn't know youse and Mag was workin' together." "Mabbe," observed Jimmie Dale as ungraciously as before, "mabbe dere's some more things youse don't know." "Aw, cough up de grouch!" advised the Magpie, with a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. "Youse don't need to be sore all night. I told youse I wasn't tryin' to hand youse one, didn't I?" "Never mind Larry, Slimmy," put in the Tocsin petulantly. "He's down on his luck, dat's all. He ain't had de price of a pinch of coke fer 2 days." "Oh ho!" exclaimed the Magpie, grinning again. "So dat's wot's givin' youse de pip, eh, Larry? Well, den, say, youse can take it from me dat mabbe youse'll be glad I blew around. I was lookin' fer a guy about yer size fer a little job to night, an' I wasn't thinkin' of lettin' young Dutch in on it. But seem' youse are here and in wid Mag, an' dat I got to get Mag in, too, youse are on if youse say de word." "Wot's de lay?" inquired Larry the Bat, unbending a little. The Magpie cocked his eye and stuck his tongue in his cheek. "Good night!" he said tersely. "Nothin' like dat. Are youse on, or ain't youse?" "Well, den, wot's in it fer me?" persisted Larry the Bat. "More'n de price of a coke sneeze," returned the Magpie pertinently. "Dere's a century note fer youse, an' mabbe 2 or 3 of dem fer Mag." Larry the Bat's eyes gleamed avariciously. "Oh, quit yer kiddin'!" he said gruffly. "A century note fer me! Dat's wot I said." "Youse heard me," rejoined the Magpie shortly. "Only if it listens good to youse now. I don't want to squeal in after de divvy. I'm takin' de chances. Youse has de soft end of it. 1 century note for youse, an' de rest is none of yer business. Dat's puttin' it straight, ain't it? Well, wot do youse say, an' say it quick, 'cause if youse ain't comin' in, youse can beat it out of here so's I can talk to Mag." "Dere ain't nothin' I would take a chance on fer 100 plunks," declared Larry the Bat with sudden fervency, and stared, anxiously expectant, at the Magpie. "Sure, I'm on, Slimmy. Sure, I am. Cut it loose. Spill de story." "Well, den," said the Magpie, "I wants—" "Youse ain't through yet," interrupted the Tocsin tartly. "I ain't heard youse askin' me nothin'. I ain't done me uppers like Larry, an' mabbe de price don't cut so much ease. See?" "Oh," said the Magpie, with a smirk, "I don't have to ask youse on dis lay. Dis is where youse come in on it fer marbles. Say, dis is where we gets de hook into a guy by de name of Henry LaSalle. Get me?" "Henry LaSalle!" Under the table Jimmie Dale's hand clenched suddenly, but not a muscle of his face moved, save, as with the tip of his tongue, he shifted the butt of the cigarette that was hanging royally from his lower lip to the other corner of his mouth. "Sure, she's got you, Slimmy!" he flung out with a grin as the Tocsin wrinkled up her face menacingly and began to mumble to herself. "He's de guy dat handed her one when she was young, an' she's been layin' fer him ever since. Sure, I know. Ain't I worked him for her till I wears me shoes out tryin' to get somethin' on him? Sure, she's in on it. Go on, Slimmy, wot's de lay? Wot do I do for dat century?" The Magpie hitched his chair closer to the table, and, as his sharp little ferret eyes glanced around the room, motioned the two to bring their heads nearer. "One of me influential broker friends down on Wall Street put me wise," he said with a wink. "Dat's good enough fer youse two, as far as dat goes. But take it from me, I got it dead straight." He lowered his voice. "Say, he's one of de richest mugs in New York, ain't he? Well, he's been selling stocks and bonds all day, thousands and thousands of dollars worth, for cash." "All them things is always sold for cash," remarked Larry the Bat fatuously. "Oh, forget it," said the Magpie earnestly. "For cash, I said. De coin, de long green, understand? He wasn't showing no checks for what he sold into the bank, except to get them cashed. That's what he's been doing all day, getting the checks cashed and getting the money in big bills, see? I know of one bunch of 80,000, and that's only one." "What for?" inquired Larry the Bat. It was the question that was pounding at his brain as he stared innocently at the Magpie. What did it mean? Why was Henry LaSalle turning and, if the Magpie was right, feverishly turning every security he could lay his hands on into cash? And then, in a flash, the answer came. They had not found the package. Equally to them as to the Tocsin, sitting there before him, it meant life and death. If the package were found by the Tocsin instead of themselves, the game was up. They were preparing for eventualities. If they were forced to run at a moment's notice, they at least were not going to run empty-handed. Far from empty-handed, it seemed. It would not be difficult for the state executor to realize a vast sum in short order on instantly marketable, gilt-edged securities, say $500,000. Not very bulky either in large bills. $5,100 bills would make $500,000. It was astonishing how small a handbag, say, might hold a fortune. "What for, Slimmy?" he inquired again, wiggling his cigarette butt on his tongue tip. "What he do that fer?" "How the hell do youse suppose I knows?" demanded the Magpie, politely scornful. "That's his business. That ain't what's worryin' me." "No, sure it ain't," admitted Larry the Bat ingratiatingly. "But go on, keep movin', Slimmy. What's he done with the stuff?" "Done with it?" echoed the Magpie, with a short laugh. "What do youse think? He been luggin' it home to his swell joint up there on the Avenue and crammin' his safe full of it." Larry the Bat sucked in his breath. "Gee, dat's soft!" he muttered, and then suddenly, as though with painful inspiration, "Say, Slimmy, say, are youse sure youse ain't been handed a steer?" The Magpie grinned wickedly. "I ain't fallin' fer steers," he said shortly. "Dis is on de level." Jimmie Dale lurched up from his chair, and, leaning over the lamp chimney, drew wheezily on his cigarette to get a light. His eyes sought the Tocsin's face. To all intents and purposes she was entirely absorbed in the Magpie. He sat down again to gape with a well-stimulated, dog-like admiration at Slimmy Joe. Was this, too, a plant? Why had the Magpie come to them with this story of Henry LaSalle? And then, the next instant, as the Magpie spoke, his suspicions were allayed. "Let's get down to cases," the Magpie invited crisply. "I didn't blow in here just by luck. This Henry LaSalle is the guy youse worked fer once, ain't he, Mag? Dat's the spiel, ain't it? He sent youse up fer pinchin' de tacks out of his carpets?" "I never pinched nothin'," snarled Silver Mag truculently. "He's a dirty liar. I never did." Cut it out, can dat?" complained the Magpie patiently. "De point is, youse worked in his house, didn't youse?" "Sure, I did," snapped the Tocsin, sullenly aggressive. "But " "Well, den dat's what I want. Dat's what I come fer. Mag, a plan of de house, say?" Jimmie Dale could feel the Tocsin's eyes upon him, questioning, searching, seeking a cue. A plan of the house? Yes or no, and a decision on the instant. "Sure!" said Larry the Bat brightly. "Dat's what I was thinkin' youse were after all de time. Say, youse are all right, Slimmy. Youse are de kind to work wid. Go on, Mag, draw the dope fer Slimmy. Dat's better dan tryin' to put one over on de swell guy. This'll make him squeal fair." The Magpie produced a pencil and a piece of paper from his pocket and laid them on the table in front of the Tocsin. "There youse are," he announced. "Help yourself, and go to it, Mag." The Tocsin, evidently not quite certain of her part, wet the pencil doubtfully on the end of her tongue. "I ain't never drawed plans," she said anxiously. "Mabbe" she glanced at Jimmie Dale "mabbe I dunno how to do it right." "Aw, go ahead!" nodded Larry the Bat. "Youse can do it right, Mag. Youse don't have to make no oil paintin'. All de Magpie wants is de doors an' windows, eh, Slimmy?" "Sure!" agreed the Magpie encouragingly. "Dat's all, Mag. Just mark de rooms out on de first floor an' de basement. Youse can explain what youse're doin' as youse go along. I'll get youse." The Tocsin cackled maliciously in assent, and then, while the Magpie got up from his chair and stood peering over her shoulder, she began to draw laboriously, her brows knitted, the pencil hooked awkwardly between cramped up forefinger and thumb. Larry the Bat slouched forward over the table, his chin in his hands, appeared to watch the proceedings with mild interest, but his eyes, like a hawk's, were following every line on the paper, transferring them to his brain, photographing every detail of the plan in his mind. And as he watched, there seemed something that was near to asthma of all that was ironical with the Magpie standing there, his sharp little black eyes drinking in greedily the Tocsin's work, in the Tocsin herself aiding and abetting in the projected theft of her own money. How far would he let the Magpie go? He did not know. Perhaps, who could tell? All the way. Between now and then there lay that package. If it were at Makoff's, at Spider Jack's, if he could find it, get it, the Magpie, as a temporary custodian of the estate's money, would at least preclude its loss by flight if the Crime Club took alarm too quickly. Larry the Bat's eyes, under half closed lids, rested musingly on the Magpie's face. The Magpie would not get very far away with it. On the other hand, if he failed at Spider Jack's, if, after all, he was wrong, and the package had never been there, or if they had forestalled him, turned the trick upon him, already secured it, then Larry the Bat's lips, working on his cigarette, formed in a twisted smile. Then, well then, that was quite another matter. Perhaps he and the Magpie might not agree so far. $500,000 was perhaps not much out of 11 millions, but it was a salvage not to be despised. Why did he say $500,000? Well, why not? If the Magpie knew of a single transaction of 80,000, and there had been many transactions during the day, $500,000 was little likely to prove an exaggeration, and the less likely in view of the fact that, if those in the Crime Club were preparing for an emergency, they would not stint themselves in the disposal of securities. The Magpie was keeping up a running fire of questions as the Tocsin toiled on with her pencil. Where did the hall lead to? How many windows in the library? Did she remember the kind of fastenings? Did the servants sleep in the basement or above? And finally, twice over, as she finished the clumsy drawing and pushed it toward him, he demanded minute details of the position of the safe. "Oh, dat's all right, Slimmy," Larry the Bat cut in airily. "If youse forget anything when youse get in there, youse can ask me. I got it cinched." The Magpie folded the paper and stowed it carefully away in his pocket. "Ask youse, eh?" he grunted sarcastically. "An' where do youse think youse'll be about dat time?" "In dere wid youse, of course," replied Larry the Bat promptly. "Dat's wot youse said." "Yes, youse will not," announced the Magpie with cold finality. "Do youse think I want to queer myself? A hot one youse'd be on the inside job. Youse'll be outside, wid yer peepers skinned for de bulls, youse an' Mag here too. See? Get dat straight. While I'm on de job youse two plays de game. Now youse listen to me, both of youse. Don't start nothin' unless youse has to. If it's a cinch I got to make a getaway, youse two start a drunk fight. Get me? Use no delay. Throw the talk loud and I'll fade. That's all. We'll crack the crib early. It'll be quiet enough up there by 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock? Larry the Bat shook his head. What time was it now? It was about 9 when he had first met the Tocsin, then the Sanctuary, then the long walk as he had followed her, say a 9:45 for that, and he had certainly been here with her not less than an hour and a half. It must be after 11 then. 1 o'clock. And before that must come Makoff and Spider Jack. The night that half an hour ago had seemed so sterile was crowding a program of events upon him now, too fast. "Nothin' doin'," he said thoughtfully. "Youse are in wrong dere, Slimmy. 1 o'clock don't go. Say, take it from me, I watched dat guy too many nights for Mag. 'Tain't often he leaves de club before 1 o'clock, and he ain't never in bed before 2. "All right," agreed the Magpie after a moment's reflection. "Youse ought to know. Make it 3 o'clock." He pulled a cigar from his pocket, lighted it, and, leaning back in his chair, stuck his feet up on the table. "If youse don't mind, Mag, I'll stick around a while," he decided calmly. "Mabbe the less I'm seen tonight the better, and I guess there won't be nobody looking for me here." Larry the Bat coughed suddenly, and rose up a little heavily from his chair. He had not counted on that. If the Magpie was settling down for a prolonged stay, it devolved upon him, Jimmie Dale, to get away, and at once, and without exciting the Magpie's suspicions. He coughed again, looked nervously from the Tocsin to the Magpie, stammered, swallowed hard, and coughed once more. "Well, what's bitten youse?" inquired the Magpie ironically. "Nothin'," said Larry the Bat, and hesitated. "Nothin', only " He hesitated again, and then the words in a rush. "Say, Slimmy, couldn't youse come across with a piece of dat century now?" "What fer?" demanded the Magpie a little aggressively. Larry the Bat cleared his throat with a desperate effort. "Youse knows," he admitted sheepishly. "Just scream me de price of one, Slimmy, just one." "Coke!" exploded the Magpie. "And get soaked to the eyes!" "Not by a damned sight!" "No, honest to God, no, Slimmy, just one," pleaded Larry the Bat. "Nix!" said the Magpie shortly. Larry the Bat thrust out a hand before the Magpie's eyes that shook tremulously. "I've got to have it!" he declared with sudden fierceness. "I got to! See? Look at me! I ain't going to be no good to night if I don't. I tell youse, I got to! I ain't going to row youse down, Slimmy, honest, I ain't. Just one, and it'll set me up if I don't get none. I'll be on de rocks before morning. Dat's straight, Slimmy. Ask Mag, she knows." "Aw, let him go get it!" broke in the Tocsin wearily. "Dat's de best thing youse can do, Slimmy. Dear all like when dey gets in his class." "Youse cocaine sniffers gives me dead pip!" snorted the Magpie in disgust. He dug down into his pocket, produced a bill, and flung it across the table to Larry the Bat. "Well, dere youse are. But youse can take it from me, Larry, dat if youse get whiffed," he swore threateningly, "I'll crack every bone in yer face. Get me?" "Slimmy," said Larry the Bat fervently, grabbing at the bill with a hungry hand, "youse can count on me. I'll be up dere on the job before youse are. 3 o'clock, eh? Well, so long, Slimmy." He slouched eagerly to the door. "So long, Mag." He paused on the threshold for a single, quick flung, significant glance. "See youse on de avenue, Mag. I'll be up dere before youse are. So long." "Oh, so long!" said the Tocsin contemptuously. And an instant later Jimmie Dale closed the outer door behind him. Part 2, Chapter 11. The Magpie. From The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Read by Lars Rolander. Part 2, Chapter 12 of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Lars Rolander. Part 2, The Woman in the Case. Chapter 12. John Johansson, 428. Nearly midnight already. It was even later than he had thought. Larry the Bat pressed his face against the shop's window pane on the Bowery for a glance at a clock that had caught his eyes on the wall within. Nearly midnight. He slouched on again hurriedly, still debating in his mind, as he had been debating it all the way from the Tocsin's, the question of returning again to the Sanctuary. So far the way both to Spider Jack's and the Sanctuary had been in the same direction. But the Sanctuary was on the next street. Jimmie Dale reached the corner and hesitated. It was strange how strong was the intuition upon him tonight that bade him go on and make all speed to Spider Jack's, while equally strong was the cold, stubborn logic that bade him go first to the Sanctuary. There were things that he needed there that would probably be absolutely essential to him before the night was out, things without which he might be so badly handicapped as to invite failure from the start. And yet it was already midnight. Ostensibly, both Makoff and Spider Jack closed their places at 11. But that might mean anything, depending upon their own respective inclinations, or on what of their own peculiar brand of deviltry might be afoot. If they were still about, still in evidence, he was still too early. Midnight though it was, though, on the other hand, if the coast was clear, he could ill afford to lose a moment of the time between now and the hour that the Magpie had planned for the robbery of Henry LaSalle. For it would not be an easy matter, even once inside Spider Jack's, to find that package, since it was Spider's open boast that things committed to his care were where the police or anyone else might as well whistle and suck their thumbs as try to find them. And then, with sudden decision, taking his hesitation as it were by the throat, Jimmie Dale hurried on again to the Sanctuary. At most it could delay him but another 15 minutes, and by 12:30 or 1:45 at the latest he would be at Spider Jack's. Disdaining the secrecy of the side door on the alley, for who had a better right or was better known there than Larry the Bat, a tenant of years, he entered the tenement by the front door, scuffled up the stairs to the first landing, and let himself into his disreputable room. He locked the door behind him, lighted the choked and wheezy gas jet, in a single, sharp-flung glance assured himself that the blinds were tightly shut, and, kneeling in the far corner, threw back the oilcloth and lifted up the low section of the flooring beneath. He reached inside, fumbling under the neatly folded clothes of Jimmie Dale, and in a moment laid his leather girdle with his kit of burglar's tools on the floor beside him. And beside that again an electric flashlight, a black silk mask, and what he had never expected to use again when, early the night before, he had, as he had believed, put it away forever, the thin metal insignia case of the Gray Seal. Another moment, and, with the flooring replaced, the oilcloth rolled back into position, he had stripped off his coat and was pulling his spotted, greasy shirt off over his head. Then, stooping quickly, he picked up the girdle, put it on, put on his shirt again over it, put on his coat, put the metal case, the flashlight, and the mask in his pockets, and once more the Sanctuary was in darkness. It was perhaps 15 minutes later that Jimmie Dale turned into the upper section of Thompson Street. Here he slowed his pace, that had been almost a run since he had left the sanctuary, and began to shuffle leisurely along, for the street that a few hours before would have been choked with its push carts and vendors, its half-naked children playing where they could find room in the gutters, its sidewalks thronged with shawled women and picturesquely dressed, earringed, dark-visaged men, a scene, as it were, transported from some foreign land, was still far from deserted. The quiet, if quiet it could be called, was but comparative. There were many yet about, and he had no desire to attract attention by any evidence of undue haste. And besides, Spider Jack's was just ahead, making the corner of the alleyway a few 100 feet farther on, and he had very good reasons for desiring to approach Spider's little novelty store at a pace that would afford him every opportunity for observation. On he shuffled along the street until, reaching Spider Jack's, a little two-storied, tumble-down brick structure, a muttered exclamation of satisfaction escaped him. The shop was closed and dark, and, though Spider Jack lived above the store, there were no lights even in the upper windows. Spider Jack presumably was either out or in bed. So far, then, he could have asked for nothing more. Jimmie Dale edged in close to the building as he slouched by, so close that his hat brim seemed to touch the window pane. It was possible that from a room at the rear of the store there might be a light with a telltale ray perhaps filtering through, say, a door crack, but there was nothing, only blackness within. He paused at the corner of the building by the alleyway. Down here, adjoining the high board fence of Spider Jack's backyard, Makoff made pretence at pawnbrokering in a small and dingy wooden building that was little more pretentious than a shed, and in Makoff's place, so far as he could see, there was no light either. Jimmie Dale's fingers were industriously rolling a cigarette as, under the brim of his slouch hat, his eyes were noting every detail around him. A yard in, against the wall of Spider Jack's, the wall cutting of the rays of the street lamp at a sharp angle, it was shadowy and black. And beyond that, farther in, the alleyway was like a pit. It would take less, far less than the fraction of a second to gain that yard, but someone was approaching behind him, and a little group of people loitered, with annoying persistency, directly across the way on the other side of the street. Jimmie Dale stuck the cigarette between his lips, fumbled in his pockets, and finally produced a box of matches. The group opposite was moving on now. The footsteps he had heard behind him, those of a man, drew nearer, the man passed by, and the box of matches in Jimmie Dale's hand dropped to the ground. He reached to pick them up, and in his stooping posture, without seeming to turn his head, flung a quick glance behind him up the street. No one, for that fraction of a second that he needed, was near enough to see. And, in that fraction of a second, Jimmie Dale disappeared. A dozen yards down the lane he sprang for the top of the high fence, gripped it, and, lithe and active as a cat, swung himself up and over and dropped noiselessly to the ground on the other side. Here he stood motionless for a moment, close against the fence to get his bearings. The rear of Spider Jack's building loomed up before him, the back windows as unlighted as those in front. Luck so far, at least, was with him. He turned and looked about him, and his eyes growing accustomed to the darkness, he could just make out Makoff's place, bordering the end of the yard, nor, from this new vantage point, could he discover any more than before a single sign of life about the pawnbroker's establishment. Jimmie Dale stole forward across the yard, mounted the 3 steps of the low stoop at Spider Jack's back door, and tried the door cautiously. It was locked. From his pocket came the small steel instrument that had stood Larry the Bat in good stead 100 times before in similar circumstances. He inserted it in the keyhole, worked deftly with it for an instant, and tried the door again. It was still locked. And then Jimmie Dale smiled, almost apologetically. Spider Jack did not use ordinary locks on his back door. The discountenanced instrument went back into his pocket, and now Jimmie Dale's hand slipped inside his shirt, and from one of the little upright pockets of the leather belt, and from still another, and from after that a third, came the vicious little blued steel tools. The sensitive fingers travelled slowly up and down the side of the door, and then he was at work in earnest. A minute passed, another. There was a dull, low, grating sound, a snick as of metal yielding suddenly, and Jimmie Dale was coolly stowing away his tools again inside his shirt. He pushed the door open an inch, listened, then swung it wide, stepped inside, and closed it behind him. A round, white beam of light flashed in a quick circle and went out. It was a sort of storeroom, innocent enough and orderly enough in appearance, bare-floored, with boxes and packing cases piled neatly against the walls. In one corner a staircase led to the story above, and from above, quite audibly, he caught the sound of snoring. Spider Jack was in bed then. Directly facing him was the open door of another room, and Jimmie Dale, moving softly forward, entered it. He had never been in Spider Jack's before, and his first concern was to form an intimate acquaintanceship with his surroundings. Again the flashlight circled, and again went out. "No windows," muttered Jimmie Dale under his breath. "Nothing very fancy about the architecture. 3 rooms in a row. Store in front of this room, through that door, of course. Wonder if the door's locked, though it's a foregone conclusion the package wouldn't be in there." Not a sound, his tread silent, he crossed to the closed door that he had noticed. It was unlocked, and he opened it tentatively a little way. A faint glow of light diffused itself through the opening. Jimmie Dale nodded his head and closed the door again. The street lamp shining through the shop windows accounted for the light. And now the flashlight played with steady inquisitiveness about him. The room in which he stood seemed to combine a sort of office with a lounging room, in which Spider Jack no doubt entertained his particular cronies. There was table in the center, cards still upon it, chairs about it. Against the wall farthest away from the shop stood a huge old-fashioned cabinet, and a little farther along, angle-wise, partitioning off the corner, as it were, hung for some purpose or other a cretonne curtain. Also against the wall next to the lane, bringing a commiserating smile to Jimmie Dale's lips as his eyes fell upon it, was a clumsy, lumbering, antique safe. Jimmie Dale's eyes returned to the curtain. What was it doing there? What was it for? Instinctively he stepped over to examine it. A single glance, however, as he lifted it aside, sufficed. It was nothing but a makeshift clothes closet. He turned from it, switched off the flashlight, and stood staring meditatively into the darkness. In a strange house, with the knowledge to begin with that what he sought was carefully hidden, it was no sinecure to find that package. He had never for a moment imagined that it would be. But of one thing, however, there was no uncertainty in his mind. He would get the package, by search if possible, by other means if search failed. It was now close to 1 o'clock. If by 2 o'clock his efforts had been fruitless, Spider Jack would hand over the package at the revolver point. It was quite simple. Meanwhile, Jimmie Dale shrugged his shoulders and, going over to the safe, knelt down in front of it. Meanwhile, as well begin here as anywhere else. The trained fingers closed on the handle, and on the instant, as though in startled amazement, shifted to the dial. They came back to the handle, a wrench, then a low, amused chuckle, and the door swung open. The great unwieldy thing was only a monumental bluff. It not only had not been locked, but it could not be locked. The mechanism was out of order. The bolts could not be moved by so much as a hair's breadth. Still chuckling, Jimmie Dale shot the flashlight's ray into the interior of the safe, and the chuckle died on his lips, and into his face came a look of strange bewilderment. Inside everything was in chaos, books, papers, a miscellany of articles, as though they had been ruthlessly pulled out on the floor, then gathered up in an armful and crammed back inside again. For an instant he did not move, and then a queer, hard, mirthless smile drew down the corners of his mouth. With a sort of bitter, expectant nod of his head, he turned the light upon the door of the safe. Yes, there were the scratches that the tools had left, and, as though in sardonic jest, the holes where the steel bit had bored were plugged with putty and rubbed over with some black substance that was still wet and came off, smearing his finger as he touched it. It could not have been done long ago, then. How long? A half hour? An hour? Not more than that. Mechanically he closed the door of the safe, rose to his feet, and, almost heedless of noise now, the flashlight ray dancing before him, he jumped across to the old-fashioned cabinet and pulled the door open. Here, as within the safe, all inside, plain evidence of thorough if hasty search, was scattered and tossed about in hopeless confusion. He shut the cabinet door. The flashlight went out, and he stood like a man stunned, the sense of some abysmal disaster upon him. He was too late. The game was up. If it had ever been here, the package was gone now. Gone! The Crime Club had been here before him. The game was up. The game was up. His mind seemed to keep on repeating that. The Crime Club had beaten him by an hour at most, and had been here, and had searched. It was strange, though, that they should have been at such curious pains to cover their tracks by leaving the room in order, by such paltry efforts to make the safe appear untouched, when the first glance that was at all critical would disclose immediately what had been done. Why should they need to cover their tracks at all? Or, if it was necessary, why, above all, in such a pitiful, inadequate way? His mind barked back to the same ghastly refrain. The game was up. No, not yet. There was still a chance. There was still Spider Jack. Suppose, in spite of their search, they had failed to find the package. Jimmie Dale's lips set in a thin line as he stared abruptly toward the door. There was still that chance, and one thing was grimly certain. Spider Jack would at least show him where the package had been. And then, halfway to the door, he halted suddenly and stood still, listening. An electric bell was ringing loudly, imperiously somewhere upstairs. Followed almost immediately the sound of someone, Spider Jack presumably, moving hurriedly about overhead, and then, a moment later, steps coming down the staircase in the adjoining room. Jimmie Dale drew back, flattening himself against the wall. Spider Jack entered the room, stumbled across it in the darkness, fumbled for the door that led into his little shop, opened it, passed through, fumbled around in there again for matches evidently, then lighted a gas jet in the store, and going to the street door opened it. Jimmie Dale had edged along the wall a little to a position where he had an unobstructed view through the open doorway connecting the shop and the room in which he stood. Spider Jack, in trousers and shirt, hastily donned, no doubt, as he had got out of bed, was standing in the street doorway, and beyond him loomed the forms of several men. Spider Jack stepped aside to allow his visitors to enter, and suddenly, a cry barely suppressed upon his lips, Jimmie Dale involuntarily strained forward. 3 men had entered, but his eyes were fixed, fascinated, upon only one, the first of the 3. Was it an hallucination? Was he mad? Dreaming? It was Hilton Travers, the chauffeur, the man whom he could have sworn he had last seen dead, lashed in that chair, in that ghastly death's chamber of the Crime Club. "Rather rough on you, Spider, to pull you out of bed at this hour," the chauffeur was saying apologetically. "Oh, that's all right, seeing it's you, Travers," Spider Jack answered, gruffly amiable. Only I was kind of looking for you last night." "I know," the chauffeur replied, "but I couldn't connect with my friends here." "Shake hands with them, Spider. Bob Marvin, Harry Stead." "Glad to know you, gents," said Spider Jack, with a hand grip apiece. The chauffeur lowered his voice a little. "I suppose we're alone here, Spider? Yes? Well, then, you know what I've come for. That package. Marvin and Stead here are the ones that are in on it with me. Get it for me, will you, Spider?" "Sure, Mr. Johansson," Spider grinned. "Sure, come on into the back room and make yourselves comfortable. I'll be maybe 5 minutes or so." Jimmie Dale's brain was whirling. What did it mean? He could not seem to understand. His mind seemed to refuse its functions. Travers, the chauffeur, alive! He drew in his breath sharply. That curtain in the corner! He must see this out now. They were coming. Quick, noiseless, he stole along the side of the wall, reached the corner, and slipped in behind the curtain as Spider Jack, striking a match, entered the room. Spider Jack lighted the gas, and, as the others followed behind him, waved them towards the chairs around the table. "I'll just ask you gents not to leave the room," he said meaningly over his shoulder as he stepped toward the rear door. "It's kind of a fad of mine to keep some things even from my wife." "All right, Spider, I understand," the chauffeur returned readily. Jimmie Dale's knife cut a tiny slit in the cretonne on a level with his eyes. The three men had seated themselves at the table and appeared to be listening intently. Spider Jack's footsteps echoed back as he crossed the rear room, sounded dull and muffled descending the stoop outside, and died away. "I told you it wasn't in the house," the man who'd been introduced as Stead laughed shortly. "We wasted the hour we had here." The third man spoke crisply, incisively to the chauffeur. "Turn down that gas jet a little. You've got across with it so far, but you can't stand a searchlight, Clark." And at the words, in a flash, the meaning of it, all of it, to the last detail that was spelling death, ruin and disaster for her, the Tocsin, for himself as well, burst upon Jimmie Dale. That voice! He would have known it, recognized it among 1,000. It was the masked man of the night before, the leader, the head of the Crime Club, and it was not Travers there at all. He remembered now too well that second room they had showed him in the Crime Club, its multitude of disguises, though in this case they had the dead man's clothes ready to their hands. The leader's boast that impersonation was but child's play to them. And now he understood why they had covered up the traces of their search in only so curiously inadequate a manner. They had failed to find the package, and, as a last resort, had adopted the ruse of impersonating Hilton Travers, the chauffeur, which made it necessary that when they called Spider Jack from his bed, as they had just done, that Spider Jack, at a casual glance, should notice nothing amiss. But it would be no more than a casual glance, for, who should know better than they, he would not have to go far for the package to any place that they had disturbed. And he, Jimmie Dale, could only stand here and watch them, helpless, powerless to move. 3 of them. A step out into the room was to invite certain death. It would not matter his death if he could gain anything for her, for the Tocsin, by it. But what could he gain by dying? He clenched his hands until the nails bit into the flesh. Spider Jack re-entered the room, carrying what looked like a large, bulky manila envelope, heavily sealed, in his hand. He tossed it on the table. "There you are, Travers," he said. "I wonder," suggested the leader pleasantly, "if, now that we're here, Travers, your friend would mind letting us have this room for a few minutes to ourselves to clean up the business?" "Sure!" agreed Spider Jack cordially. "You're welcome to it. I'll wait out here in the store until you say the word." He went out, closing the door after him. The leader picked up the package. "We'll take no chances with this," he said grimly. "It's been too close a call. After we've had a look at it, we'll put it out of harm's way on the spot. Here while we've got it, before we leave." He ripped the package open and disclosed perhaps a dozen official-looking documents, beside a miscellaneous number of others. He took up the first of the papers, glanced through it hurriedly, then tossed it to the pseudo chauffeur. "Tear it up, and tear it up small," he ordered tersely. The next, after examining it as he had the first, he tossed to the other man. "Go ahead," curtly. "Work fast. From the look of these, Travers had us cold. There's proof enough here of LaSalle's murder to send us all to the chair." He went on glancing through the documents, and then suddenly, joining the others in their work, began to rip and tear at the papers himself. A sort of cold horror had settled upon Jimmie Dale, and his forehead was clammy wet. The inhuman irony of it, that he should stand there and watch, impotent to prevent it, the destruction of what he would have given his life to secure. And then, slowly, a grim, hard, merciless smile came upon his lips. He had recognized the leader's voice. Now he would recognize the leader's face. At least that was left to him, perhaps the master trump of all. It would not be very hard to find the Crime Club now, with that man to lead the way. The scraps of paper, tiny shreds, mounted into a heap on the table, and with the last of the contents of the package destroyed, the leader stood up. "Put these pieces in your pockets. We don't want to leave them here," he directed quietly. "And then let's get out." In scarcely a moment the last scrap of paper had vanished. The three men walked to the door, passed through it, and joined Spider Jack in the store, and Jimmie Dale, slipping out from behind the curtain, gained the door of the rear room, crept through it, reached the stoop, and then, darting like the wind across the yard, was over the fence in a second, and in another was out of the alleyway and on the street. He was in time, in plenty of time. They had just left Spider Jack's and were perhaps 50 yards or so ahead of him. He slouched on behind them, the cold, grim smile on his lips once more. It was the Crime Club now, that hell's cradle where the devil's schemes were hatched. That was the one thing left to him. They would lead him to that, and then it would be his turn to strike. They turned the first corner, and suddenly, as the racing engine of an automobile caught his ear, he broke into a run and dashed around the corner after them, in time to see them jump into a car, and the car speed off along the street. He halted as though he were suddenly dazed, started involuntarily to run forward, stopped with a hollow laugh at the futility of it, and stood still and motionless on the sidewalk. And then he swayed a little, and his face grew gray. Failure, defeat, ruin. In that moment he knew them all to their bitterest dregs. How could he go to her? How could he face her and tell her that they were beaten, that the last hope was gone, that he had failed? "God!" he cried aloud and clenched his hands. Then, deep in his consciousness, a thought stirred, and he swept a shaking hand across his eyes. Why had it come again, that thought? Did it mean that he must play the last card? There was a way. There had always been a way. The way the Crime Club took. Murder. It was their own weapon. If the man who posed as Henry LaSalle were killed, if that man were killed. The Magpie was to be there at 3, he muttered, and started mechanically back along the street. End of Part 2, Chapter 12. From The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Read by Lars Rolander.
Part 2, Chapter 13 of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Roger Moline. Part 2. The Woman in the Case. Chapter 13. The Only Way. It was a horrible thing, and it grew upon him. In a blind, mechanical way, his brain receptive to nothing else, Jimmie Dale walked on along the street. To kill a man. Death he had faced himself 100 times, witnessed it 100 times in its most violent forms, had seen murder done before his eyes, had been in straits where, to save his own life, it had seemed the one last desperate chance, and yet his hands were still clean. To kill a man in fair fight, in struggle, when the blood was hot, was terrible enough, a possibility that was always before him, the one thing from which he shrank, the one thing that, as the Gray Seal, he had always feared. But to kill a man deliberately, to creep upon his victim with hideous, cold-blooded premeditation, he shivered a little, and his hand shook as he drew it nervously across his eyes. But there was no other way. Again and again, insidiously grappling with his revulsion, with the horror that the impulse to murder inspired, came that other thought. There was no other way. If the man who posed as Henry LaSalle were dead, if he were dead. If he were dead. See, now, what would happen if that man were dead? How clear his brain was on that point. The whole plot would tumble like a house of cards about the heads of the Crime Club. The courts would require an auditing of the estate by a trustee of the court's own appointing, who would continue to administer it until the Tocsin's 25th birthday, or until there was tangible evidence of her death. But the Tocsin, automatically with her pseudo-uncle's death, could publicly appear again. Her death could no longer benefit the Crime Club, since it, the Crime Club, with the supposed uncle dead, could not profit through the false Henry LaSalle inheriting as next of kin. It was the weak link, the vulnerable point in the stupendous scheme of murder and crime with which these hell fiends had played for and won, so far, the stake of 11 millions. Not that they had overlooked or been blind to this, they were too clever, too cunning for that. It was only that they had planned to accomplish the Tocsin's death, as they had her father's and uncle's, and establish the false Henry LaSalle in undisputed possession and ownership of the estate, and had failed in that up to the present. But the material results remained the same, so long as the Tocsin, to save her life, was forced to remain in hiding, so long as proof that would convict the Crime Club was not forthcoming, so long as that man lived. Time passed to which Jimmie Dale was oblivious. At times he walked slowly, scarcely moving. At times his pace was a nervous, hurried stride that was almost a run. And as he was oblivious to time, so was he oblivious to his surroundings, to the direction which he took. At times his forehead was damp with moisture that was not there from physical exertion. At times his face, deathly white, was full as of the vision of some shuddering, abhorrent sight. At times his lips were thinned into a straight line, and there was a glitter in the dark eyes that was not good to see, while his hands at his sides clenched until the skin, tight over the knuckles, was an ivory white. To kill a man. What other way was there? The proof that it had taken Hilton Travers years to obtain, the proof on which the Tocsin's life depended, was destroyed utterly, irreparably. It could never be duplicated. Hilton Travers was dead. Murdered! Murder! That thought again. It was their own weapon. Murder! Would one kill a venomous reptile in whose fangs was death? What right had this man to life, whose life was forfeit even under the law, for murder? Was she to drag on an intolerable existence among the dregs and the scum of the underworld, she, in her refinement and her purity, to exist among the vile and dissolute, in daily, hourly peril of her life, because the weapons that these inhuman vultures had used to rob her, to destroy those she loved, to make of her life a hideous, joyless thing, should not be used against them? But to kill a man, to steal upon a man with cold intent in the blackness of the night, and take his life, to be a murderer, to know the horror of blood forever upon one's hands, to rise, cold-sweated, in the night, fearful of the very shadows around one, to live with every detail of that fearsome act sweeping like some dread spectre at unexpected moments upon the consciousness. He put up his hands before his face, as though to blot out the thought from him. Mind and soul recoiled before it. To kill a man. He walked on, until at last, conscious of a sense of fatigue, he stopped. He must have come a long way, been walking a long time. Where was he? He looked about him for a moment in a dazed way, and suddenly, with a low cry, shrank back. As though he had been drawn to it by some ghastly magnet, he found himself standing in front of the LaSalle mansion on Fifth Avenue. No, it was not for that he had come. To kill a man. It was only to get that money. Yes, he remembered now, that money from the safe, before the Magpie got it. The Magpie was to be there at 3 o'clock, and the Tocsin was to be there too. The Tocsin! That package! He had failed. It had been her one hope, and it was gone. What could he say to her? How could he tell her the miserable truth? But he had not come there in the dead of night to kill a man. These other things were what had... "Jimmie!" It was a quick-breathed whisper. A hand was on his arm. He turned, startled. It was the Tocsin, Silver Mag. "Jimmie!" in alarm. "Why are you standing here like this? You may be seen." Seen! Suppose he were seen! He shuddered a little. "Yes, that's so," he said hoarsely. He glanced numbly up and down the wide, deserted but well-lighted avenue. It was no place, that most aristocratic section of the city, for such as Silver Mag and Larry the Bat to be seen at that hour of night, or, rather, morning. And if anything happened inside that house... I didn't think of that," he said mechanically. "Come across the street, under the stoop of that house there." She had his arm, and was half dragging him as she spoke. The alarm in her voice intensified. And then, a moment later, safe from observation, "Jimmie! Jimmie, what is the matter? What has happened? What makes you act so strangely?" "Nothing," he said. "Tell me!" she insisted wildly. And then, with a violent effort, Jimmie Dale forced his mind back to the immediate present. He was only inspiring her with terror. And there was the Magpie, and that money in the safe. "Where is the Magpie?" he asked with quick apprehension. "Am I late? Is he in there already?" "No," she said. "He hasn't come yet." "What time is it?" he demanded anxiously. "About 2:30, she replied. "But, Jimmie—" "Wait!" he broke in. "Where is he now? You were both together. And you were both to be here at 3. What are you doing here alone at 2:30? A strange little exclamation, one almost of dismay, it seemed, escaped her. "The Magpie left my place an hour ago, to get his kit, I think. And I came here at once because that was what you and I understood I was to do, wasn't it? Jimmie, you frightened me. You are not yourself. Don't you remember the last word you said, as you nodded to me behind the Magpie's back, that you would be here before us? There was no mistaking your meaning. If I could get away from him, I was to come here and meet you." Jimmie Dale passed his hand nervously across his eyes. Of course, he remembered now. What a frightful turmoil his brain had been in. "Yes, of course," he tried to speak nonchalantly. I had forgotten for the moment." She caught his arm in a quick, tight hold, shaking him in a terrified way. "You forget a thing like that? Jimmie, something terrible has happened. Can't you see that I am nearly mad with anxiety? What is it? What is it? That package, Jimmie. Is it the package?" He did not answer. What could he say? It meant life, hope, joy, everything that the world held for her, and it was gone. "Yes, it is the package," she whispered frantically. "Quick, Jimmie, tell me. It was not there? You could not find it?" "It was there," he said, as though the words were literally forced from him. Then what, Jimmie?" The clutch on his arm was like a vice. "They got it," he said. It was like a death sentence that he pronounced. "It is destroyed." She did not speak or move, save that her hands, as though nerveless and without strength, fell away from his arms and dropped to her sides. It was dark there under the stoop, though not so dark but that he could see her face. It was gray, gray as death, and there was misery and fear and a pitiful helplessness in it. And then she swayed a little, and he caught her in his arms. "Gone!" she murmured in a dead, colorless way, and suddenly laughed out sharply, hysterically. "Don't! For God's sake, don't do that!" he pleaded wildly. She looked at him then for a moment, in strange quiet, and lifted her hand and stroked his face in a numbed way. It would have been better, Jimmie, wouldn't it?" she said in the same monotonous voice. "It would have been better if I had never found out anything, and they had done the same to me that they did to father." "Marie, Marie!" It was the first time he had ever spoken her name, and it was on his lips now in an agony of tenderness and appeal. "Don't! You mustn't speak like that." "I'm tired," she said. I can't fight any more." She did not cry. She lay there in his arms quite still, like a weary child. The minutes passed. When Jimmie Dale spoke again, it was irrelevantly, and his face was very white. "Marie, describe the upper floor of that house over there for me." She roused herself with a start. "The upper floor?" she repeated slowly. Why do you ask that?" "Have you forgotten in turn?" he said with a steady smile. "That money in the safe. It's yours. We can at least save that out of the wreck. You only drew the basement plan and the first floor for the Magpie. The more I know about the house the better, of course, in case anything goes wrong. Now, see. Try and be brave, and tell me quickly, for I must get through before the Magpie comes, and I have barely half an hour." "No, Jimmie, no!" She slipped out of his arms. "Let it alone. I am afraid. I have a feeling that something will happen." "It is the only way." He said it involuntarily, more to himself than to her. "Jimmie, let it alone," she said again. "No," he said. "I am going, so tell me quickly. Every minute that we wait is one that counts against us." She hesitated an instant, and then, speaking rapidly, made a verbal sketch of the upper portion of the house for him. "It's a very large house, isn't it?" he commented innocently, to pave the way for the question, above all others, that he had to ask. "Which is your uncle's? I mean that man's room?" "The first on the right, at the head of the landing," she answered. "Only, Jimmie, don't go!" He drew her close to him again. "Now listen," he said quietly. "When the Magpie comes and finds I am not here, lead him to think that the money he gave me was too much for me, that I am probably in some den doped with drug, and that I am and hold him as long as you can on the pretext that there is always the possibility I may, after all, show up before he goes in there. You understand? And now about yourself. You must do exactly as I say. On no account allow yourself to be seen by anyone except the Magpie. I would tell you to go now, only, unless it is vitally necessary, we cannot afford to arouse the Magpie's suspicions. He'd have every crook in the underworld snarling at our heels. But you are not to wait, even for him, if you detect the slightest disturbance in that house before he comes. And equally, after he has gone in, whether I have come out or not, at the first indication of anything unusual, you are to get away at once. You understand, Marie?" "Yes," she said. But Jimmie, you—" "Just one thing more," he smiled at her reassuringly. "Did the Magpie say anything about how he intended to get in?" "Yes, by the side away from the corner of the street," she said tremulously. "You see, there's quite a space between the house and the one next door, and besides, the house next door is closed up. There's nobody there. The family has gone away for the summer. The library window there is low enough to reach from the ground." For a moment longer he held her close to him, as though he could not let her go, then bent and kissed her passionately. And in that moment all the emotions he had known as he had walked blindly from Spider Jack's that night surged again upon him, and that voice was whispering, 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 "It is the only way. It is the only way." And then, not daring to trust his voice, he released her suddenly and stepped back out from under the stoop, and the next instant he was across the deserted avenue. Another, and he had slipped through the iron gates that opened on the street driveway, and in yet another he was crouched close up against the front door of the LaSalle mansion. It was a large house, a very large house, one of the few that, even amid the wealth and luxury of that quarter, boasted its own grounds, and those so restricted as scarcely to deserve the name. But it was set far enough back from the street to escape the radius of the street lamps, and so guarantee in its shadows security from observation. It was not the Magpie's way, the front door. The obvious to the Magpie and his ilk was a thing always to be shunned. Jimmie Dale's lips were set in a grim smile, as his fingers worked with lightning speed, now taking this instrument and now that from the leather pockets in the girdle beneath his shirt. The penitentiaries were full of magpies who shunned the obvious. Very slowly, very cautiously, the door opened. He listened breathlessly, tensely. The door closed again behind him. He was inside now. Stillness, blackness, not a sound. A minute went by, another. And then, as he stood there, strained, listening, the silence itself began. It seemed to palpitate and pound, 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 and be full of strange noises. It was a horrible thing to kill a man. End of Part 2, Chapter 13. Recording by Roger Moline. Part 2, Chapter 14 of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Roger Moline. Part 2, The Woman in the Case. Chapter 14. Out of the Darkness. A moment later, Jimmie Dale stepped forward through the vestibule. He was quite calm now, a sort of cold, merciless precision in every movement succeeding the riot of turbulent emotions that had possessed him as he had entered the house. The half hour, the maximum length of time before the Magpie would appear, as he had estimated it when out there under the stoop with the Tocsin, had dwindled now to perhaps 20 minutes, 25 at the outside. 25 minutes. 25 minutes was so little that for an instant the temptation was strong upon him to sacrifice, rather than any of those precious minutes, the Magpie instead. And then, in the darkness, as he stole noiselessly across the hall, he shook his head. It would be a cowardly, brutal thing to do. What chance would a man with a record like the Magpie's stand if caught there? How easy it would be to shift the murder of the supposed Henry LaSalle to the Magpie's shoulders. Jimmie Dale's lips closed firmly. Self-preservation was, perhaps, the first law, but he would save the Magpie if he could. The Magpie should have his chance. The man might be a criminal, might deserve punishment at the hands of the law, his liberty might be a menace to the community, but he was not a murderer, his life forfeit for a crime he had never committed. If he, Jimmie Dale, could only in some way have arranged with the Tocsin out there to keep the Magpie away altogether. But it could not be done without arousing the Magpie's suspicions, and as a corollary to that, afterward, with the subsequent events, would come the deluge. The law of the underworld was clear, concise, and admitting of no appeal on that point. To double-cross a pal meant sooner or later a knife thrust, a blackjack, or— but what difference did it make what form the execution of the sentence took? And, since, then, that was out of the question, since he could not keep the Magpie away without practically risking his own life, the Magpie at least must have his chance. Jimmie Dale was at the library door now, that, according to the plan the Tocsin had drawn up for the Magpie, and as he had remembered her description when she had told him her story earlier in the evening, was just at the foot of the staircase. How dark it was! Though the stairs could be only a few feet away, he could not see them. And how intense the silence was again! Here, where he stood, the slightest stir from above must have reached him, but there was not a sound. His hand felt out for the doorknob, found it, turned it, and pushed the door open. He stepped inside the room and closed the door behind him. The safe, according to the Tocsin's plan again, was in that sort of alcove at the lower end of the library. Jimmie Dale's flashlight played inquisitively about the room. There was the window, the only one in the room, the window through which the Magpie proposed to enter. There was the archway of the alcove, with its— no, there were no longer any portieres. And there was the safe. He could see it quite plainly from where he stood at the upper end of the room. The flashlight went out for the space of perhaps 30 seconds. 30 seconds of absolute silence, absolute stillness. Then the round white ray of the light again, but glistening now on the nickel knobs and dial of the safe, and Jimmie Dale was on his knees before it. A low, scarcely breathed exclamation, that seemed to mingle anxiety and hesitation, escaped him. He, who knew the make of every safe in the country, knew this one for its true worth. 25 minutes! Could he open it in that time, let alone with any time to spare? It was not like the one in Spider Jack's. It was the kind that the Magpie, however clever he might be in his own way, would be forced to negotiate with soup, and with the attendant noise, double his chance of discovery and capture, and the responsibility for what might have happened upstairs. No, the Magpie must have his chance. And besides, the money in the safe apart, why should not he, Jimmie Dale, have his own chance as well? All this would help. The motive, robbery, the perpetrator— there was grim mockery on his lips now as the light went out and the sensitive fingers closed on the knob of the dial— the perpetrator, the Gray Seal. It would afford excellent food for the violent editorial diatribes under which the police again would writhe in frenzy. Stillness again. Silence. Only a low, tense breathing. Only, so faint that it could not be heard a foot away, a curious scratching, as from time to time the supersensitive fingers fell away from the dial to rub upon the carpet, to increase even their sensitiveness by setting the nerves to throbbing through the skin surface at the tips. And then Jimmie Dale's head, ear pressed close against the safe to catch the tumbler's fall, was lifted, and the flashlight played again on the dial. 28 1/4 left. How fast the time went, and how slowly. Still the black shape crouched there in the darkness against the safe. At times, in strange, ghostly flashes, the nickel dial with the ray upon it seemed to leap out and glisten through the surrounding blackness. At times, the quick intake of breath, as from great exertion. At times, faint, musical little clicks, as, from abortive effort, the dial whirled, preparatory to a fresh attempt. And then, at last, a gasp of relief. Ah! Came the sound, barely audible, as of steel sliding in well-oiled grooves, the muffled thud of metal meeting metal as the bolts shot back and the heavy door swung outward. Jimmie Dale stretched his cramped limbs and wiped the moisture from his face, then set to work again upon the inner door. This was an easier matter, far easier. 5 minutes, perhaps a little more, went by, and then the inner door was open, and the flashlight's ray was flooding the interior of the safe. A queer little sound, half of astonishment, half of disappointment, issued from Jimmie Dale's lips. There was money here, a great deal of money, undoubtedly, but there was no such sum as he had somehow fantastically imagined from the Magpie's evidently overcolored story that there would be. There was money, 10 packages of banknotes neatly piled in the bottom compartment, but there was no $500,000 of dollars. He picked up one of the packages hurriedly and drew in his breath. After all, there was a great deal. The notes were of $100 denomination, and on the bottom were 2 $1,000 bills. Calculated roughly, if each of the other 9 packages contained a like amount, the total must exceed $100,000. And now Jimmie Dale began to work with feverish haste. From the leather girdle inside his shirt came the thin metal insignia case, and a gray seal was stuck firmly on the dial knob of the safe. This done, he tucked away the packages of banknotes, some into his pockets and some inside his shirt, and then quickly ransacked the interior of the safe, flauntingly spilling the contents of drawers and pigeonholes out upon the floor. He stood up and, leaving the safe door wide open, walked back across the room to the window, unfastened the catch, and opened the window an inch or two. The way was open now for the Magpie. The Magpie would have no need to make any noise in forcing an entrance. He would be able to see almost at a glance that he had been forestalled by the Gray Seal, and that, as far as he was concerned, the game was up. The Magpie had his chance. If the Magpie did not take the hint and make his escape as noiselessly as he had entered, it was his own fault. He, Jimmie Dale, had given the Magpie his chance. Jimmie Dale turned from the window and made his way out of the library to the foot of the stairs, leaving the library door open behind him. How long had he been? Was it more or less than the 25 minutes? He did not know, only, as yet, the Magpie had not come, and now, perhaps, it did not make so much difference. Where was he going now? His foot was on the first stair, and suddenly he drew it back, the cold sweat bursting out on his forehead. Where was he going now? The first room on the right at the head of the landing. From his inner consciousness, as it were, the answer, in all the bald, naked horror that it implied, flashed upon him. The first room on the right. That man's room. God, how the darkness and the stillness began to palpitate again, and suddenly seemed to shriek out at him over and over the one single, ghastly word, murder. It had been with him, that thought, all the time he had been working at the safe, but it had been there then only subconsciously, like some heavy, nameless dread, subjugated for the moment by the work he had had to do, which had demanded the centered attention of every faculty he possessed. But now the moment had come when there was only that before him. Only that, nothing else. Only that, the man upstairs in the first room to the right of the landing. Why did he hesitate? Why did he stand there while the priceless moments before daylight came were passing? The man was a murderer, a blotch on society, and, his life already forfeited, he was living now only because the law had not found him out. The man was a criminal, blood-stained, and his life, because he had taken her father's life and had tried to take the Tocsin's own life, stood between her and every hope of happiness, robbing her, even literally, in a material sense, of everything that the world could hold for her. Why did he hesitate? It was that man's life or hers. It was the only way. He put his foot upon the bottom step again, paused still another instant, and then began stealthily to mount the stairs. The darkness! There had never been, it seemed, such darkness before. The stillness! He had never known silence so heavy, so full of strange premonitory pulsings. A silence that seemed so incongruously full of clamoring whispers in his ears. It must be those imagined whispers that were affecting his nerve, for now, as he gained the landing and slipped his automatic from his pocket, his hand was shaking with a queer, twitching motion. For an instant, fighting off his self-composure, he stood striving to locate his surroundings through the darkness. The staircase was a circular one, making the landing nearly at the front of the house, and rearward from this, the Tocsin had said, a hallway ran down the center, with rooms on either side. The first room to the right, therefore, should be just at his hand. He reached out, feeling cautiously. There was nothing. He edged to the right. Still nothing. Edged a little farther, a sense of bewilderment growing upon him, and finally his fingers touched the wall. It was very strange. The hallway must be much wider than he had understood it to be from what she had said. He moved along now straight ahead of him, his hand on the wall, feeling for the door, and with every step his bewilderment increased. Surely there must be some mistake. Perhaps he had misunderstood. He had come fully twice the distance that one would expect, and yet there was no door. Ah, what was that? His fingers closed on soft, heavy velvet hangings. These could hardly be in front of a door, and yet what else could it be? He drew the hangings warily apart and felt behind them. It was a window. But it was shuttered in some way, evidently, for he could not see out. Jimmie Dale stood motionless there for fully a minute. It seemed absurd, preposterous, the conviction that was being forced home upon him, that there were no rooms on the right-hand side of the corridor at all. But that was not like the Tocsin, accurate always in the most minute details. The room must be still farther along. He was tempted to use his flashlight, but that, as long as he could feel his way, was an unnecessary risk. A flashlight upstairs, where a sleeping-room door might be ajar, or even wide open, where some one wakeful, that man, himself perhaps, might see it, was quite another matter than a flashlight in the closed and deserted library below. He went on once more, still guiding himself by a light finger-touch upon the wall, past another portiere similar to the first, and after that another, and finally stopped by bringing up abruptly against the end wall of the house. It was certainly very strange. There were no rooms on the right-hand side of the corridor. And here, hanging across the end wall, was another of those ubiquitous velvet portieres. He parted it, and, a little to his surprise, found a window that was not shuttered, but that instead was heavily barred by an ornamental grille-work. He could see out, however, and found that he was looking directly out from the rear of the house. A lamp from the side street threw what was undoubtedly the garage into shadowy outline, and he made out below him a short stretch of yard between the garage and the house. He remembered that now. She had described all that to the Magpie. There was no driveway between the front and the rear. The house being on the corner, the entrance to the garage was directly from the side street. Yes, she had described all that exactly as it was, but he dropped the portiere and faced around, carrying his hand in a nonplussed way to his eyes. But here, upstairs, within the house, it was not as she had said it was at all. What did it mean? She could not have blundered so egregiously as that, unless— he caught his breath suddenly— unless she had done so intentionally. Was that it? Had she surmised, formed a suspicion of what was in his mind, of what he meant to do, and taken this means of defeating it? If so, well, it was too late for that now. There was one way, only one way. Whatever the cost, whatever it might mean for him, there was only one way out for her. His flashlight was in his hand now, and the round, white ray shot down the corridor, seemed suddenly to falter unsteadily, swept in through an open door that was almost beside him, and then, as though a nerveless hand held it, the ray dropped and played shakily in the toe of his boot before it went out. A stifled cry rose to his lips. Something cold, like a hand of ice, seemed to clutch at his heart. Those portieres, the wide, richly carpeted corridor. It was the corridor of the night before. That room at his side was the room where he had seen Hilton Travers, the chauffeur, dead, lashed in a chair. He felt the sweat beads burst out anew upon his forehead. It was the Crime Club. End of Part 2, Chapter 14. Reading by Roger Moline.
Part 2, Chapter 15. Of the Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Lars Rolander. Part 2. The Woman in the Case. Chapter 15. Retribution. His brain seemed to whirl, staggered as by some gigantic ghastly mockery. The Crime Club! Here! He had thought to creep upon that man, and he had run blindly into the very heart and center of these hell fiends' nest. Silently he stood there, holding his breath as he listened now, motionless as a statue, forcing his mind to think. He remembered that last night his impression of the place had been that it was more like some great private mansion than anything else. Well, he had been right, it seemed. He could have laughed aloud, sardonically, hysterically. It was not so strange now that there were no rooms on the right-hand side of the corridor. And what could have suited their purpose better? What, by its very location, its unimpeachable character, could be a more ideal lair for them than this house? And how grimly simple it was now, the explanation! In the 5 years that the false Henry LaSalle had been in possession, they had cunningly remodeled the upper floor, that was all. It was quite clear now why the man never entertained, why he had never been caught or found or known to be in communication with his fellow conspirators. It was no longer curious that one might watch the door of the house for months at a stretch and go unrewarded for one's pains, as the Tocsin had done, when access to the house by those who frequented it was so easy through the garage on the side street, and from the garage, if their work there was in keeping with their clever contrivances within the house, by an underground connection into, say, the cellar or basement. Again Jimmie Dale checked that nervous, unnatural inclination to laugh aloud. Was there anything, any single incident, any single detail of all that had transpired that was not explained, borne out as it could be explained and borne out in no other way save that the Crime Club should be no other than this very house itself? It was the exposition of that favourite theory of his. It was so obvious that therein lay its security. He had mocked at the Magpie not many moments before on that score, and now it was the beam in his own eye. It was so obvious now, so glaringly obvious, that the Crime Club could have been nowhere else, so obvious, with every word of the Tocsin's story pointing it out like a signpost, and he had not seen it. And then suddenly every muscle grew strained and rigid. Was there someone in the corridor? Was it someone moving, or was it only a fancy? He listened, while he strained his eyes through the darkness. There was no sound, only that abnormal, heavy silence that, yes, he remembered that too now, that had clung about him last night like a pall. He could see nothing, hear nothing, but intuitively, bringing a cold dismay, the greater because it was something unknown, intangible, he felt, as though eyes were upon him, that even in the darkness he was being watched. And as he stood there, then slowly there crept upon Jimmie Dale the sense of peril and disaster. It was not intuition now, it was certainty. He was trapped. It was the part of a fool to imagine that with their devil's cunning, their cleverness, their ingenuity, he or anyone else could enter that house unknown to its occupants. Had he made electric contact when he had opened the front door, and rung a signal here, perhaps upstairs? Had he set some system of alarm at work when he had touched that window? What did it matter, the details that had heralded his entrance? He was certain now that his presence in the house was known. Only, why had they left him so long without attack? He shook his head with a quick, impatient movement. That, too, was obvious. He was under observation. Who was he? Why had he come? Was he simply a paltry safe tapper, or was he one whom they had a real need to fear? And then, too, there might well be another reason. It was far from likely, in fact unreasonable, to imagine that all the men he had seen here the night before were in the house now. Not many of them, if any, would live here for constant, daily coming and going, even through the garage, could not escape notice. And of the servants, probably a lesser breed of criminal, some of them at least, no doubt, were engaged at that moment in watching his own house on Riverside Drive. There was even the possibility that the man posing as Henry LaSalle was, for the time being, here alone. He shook his head again. He could hardly hope for that. He had no right to hope for anything more now than a struggle, with an inevitable fatal ending to himself, but one in which at least he could sell his life as dearly as possible, one in which, perhaps, he might pay the Tocsin score with the man he had come to find. If he could do that, well, after all, the price was not too great. There were no tremors of the muscles now. It was Jimmie Dale, the Gray Seal, every faculty alert, tense, keyed up to its highest efficiency, the brain cool, keen and active, fighting for his life. The front door through which he had entered was an impossibility, but there was the window in the library that he had opened, if they would let him get that far. That was as good a chance as any. If he made an effort to find, say, a way to the flat above, and chanced some means of escape there, it would in no wise obviate an attack upon him, and he would only be under the added disadvantage of unfamiliar surroundings. Feeling out with his left hand, his automatic thrown a little forward in his right, he began to retrace his way along the blank wall of the corridor, pausing between each step to listen, moving silently, his tread on the heavy carpet as noiseless as though it were some shadow creeping there. Stillness, utter, absolute, always that stillness, always that sense of danger around him, the tense, bated expectancy of momentary attack. A revolver flash through the darkness, a sudden rush upon him, but still there was nothing. Only the darkness, only the silence. He gained the head of the stairs and began to descend, and now the strain began to tell upon his nerves again. Again he was possessed of the mad impulse to cry out, to do anything that would force the issue, that would end the horrible, unbearable suspense. Why did that revolver shot not come? Why had they not yet rushed upon him? Why were they playing with him as a cat with a mouse? Or was it all wild, fanciful imagination? No. What was that again? He could have sworn this time that he had heard a sound, but he could neither define its character nor locate the direction from which it had come. He was at the foot of the stairs now, and, guiding himself by the wall, moving now barely an inch at a time, he reached the library door that he had left open, and stole in over the threshold. Halfway down the room and diagonally across from where he stood was the window. In a moment now he could gain that, but they would never let him go so easily. And so it must come now, in that next moment, their attack. Where were they? Where were they now? The table. He must remember not to bump into the table. A pause between each step. He was crossing the room. He was halfway to the window. Had it been all fancy? Was he to... And then Jimmie Dale stood motionless. Someone had closed the library door softly. Stillness again. A sort of deadly calm upon him. Jimmie Dale felt out behind his back for the big library table that he had been circuiting. If the window were wide open, it might be done. But to jump for it and stand silhouetted there during the pause necessary to fling the window up was little less than suicidal. He edged back noiselessly until his fingers touched the table. Then, lowering himself to his knees, he backed in underneath it and lay flat upon the floor. It was not much protection, but it had one advantage. If they switched on the lights, it would show an empty room for the first instant, and that instant meant the first shot. Where were they now? By the library door? How many of them were there? Well, it was their move. Two could play a cat and mouse until daylight. That wasn't very far off now, and when that came he might still have the first shot. But after that... He turned his head quickly toward the window. There was a faint scratching noise as of fingernails gripping the sill. Then the window, very slowly, almost silently, was pushed steadily upward, and a dark form loomed up outside. And then, crawling through, a man dropped as though his feet were padded like a cat's on the floor inside the room. The Magpie! A flashlight's ray shot out, and with a twisted smile propped now on his left elbow to give free play to his revolver arm, Jimmie Dale followed the white spot eagerly with his eyes. But it did not circle around. Instead, the light was turned almost instantly toward the lower end of the room, and a second later was holding steadily on the open door of the safe and the litter of papers on the floor. Came a savage growl of amazed fury from the Magpie. Then his step down the room, and as he reached the safe, a torrent of unbridled blasphemy, and then, in a sort of a staggered gasp, as he leaned suddenly forward, examining the knob of the dial. The Gray Seal! A moment the Magpie stood there, and then, cursing again in abandon, turned and started back for the window, his flashlight dancing before him, and stopped, a snarl of fury on his lips. The flashlight was playing full on Jimmie Dale under the table. "Larry the Bat! The Gray Seal! By God!" choked the Magpie. You! The Magpie's flashlight, as he shifted it from his right hand to his left and wrenched out his revolver, had fallen upon two men crouched close against the wall by the library door, and he screamed out in an access of fury. "De double cross! A plant! De bulls! You damn snitch, Larry!" screamed out the Magpie, and fired. The bullet tore into the carpet beside Jimmie Dale. Came answering shots from the men by the door, and then the Magpie emptying his automatic at the two men as he ran, the flame tongues cutting vicious lanes of fire through the darkness, dashed for the window. There was a cry, the crash of a heavy body pitching to the floor, and the Magpie had flung himself out through the window, and in the momentary ensuing silence within the room came the sound of his footsteps running on the gravel below. There was a low moan, the movement as of someone staggering and lurching around, and then the lights went on. But for an instant Jimmie Dale did not move. He was staring at the form of a man still and motionless on the floor in front of him. The man who had posed as Henry LaSalle. Dead! The man was dead! His mind ran riot for a moment. Where were the others? Were there only these two? Only these two in the house. Only these two, and one was dead. And then Jimmie Dale was on his feet. One was dead, but there was still the other, the man who was reeling there, back turned to him by the electric light switch. But even as Jimmie Dale sprang forward, this second man, clawing at the wall for support, slipped to his knees and fell upon the carpet. Jimmie Dale reached him, snatched the revolver from his hand, and bent over him. It was the man whose name he did not know, but whose face he had reason enough to know too well. It was the leader of the Crime Club. The man, though evidently badly wounded, smiled defiantly in spite of his pain. "So you're the Gray Seal," he flung out contemptuously. "A clever enough safe cracker, but only a low brow like the rest of them. Another illusion dispelled. Well, you've got the money. Better run, hadn't you?" Jimmie Dale made no answer. Satisfied that the man was too badly hurt to move, he went and bent over the silent form in the center of the room. A moment's examination was enough. Henry LaSalle was dead. He stood there looking down at the man. It was what he had come for, though it was the Magpie, not himself, who had accomplished it. The man was dead. The words began to run through his mind in a queer reiteration. The man was dead. The man was dead. He checked himself sharply. He must think now, think fast, and think right. The Magpie knew that Larry the Bat was the Gray Seal, and as fast as the Magpie could get there, the news would spread like wildfire through the underworld. Death to the Gray Seal! Death to the Gray Seal! He could hear that slogan ringing again in his ears, but as he had never heard it before, with a snarl of triumph now, as of wolves who had at last pulled their quarry down. He had not a second to spare. And yet, that man wounded there on the floor, what of him? Guilty of murder, the brains of this inhuman, monstrous organization, the one to whom, more even than to that dead man, the Tocsin owed the horror and the misery and the grief and despair that had come into her life. What of him? What of the Crime Club here? What of this nest of vipers? Were they to escape? Were they to... With a sudden low exclamation, Jimmie Dale jumped for the table and, snatching up the telephone, rattled the hook violently. "Give me!" His voice came in well-simulated gasps, each like a man fighting for every word. "Give me police headquarters! Quick! Quick! I've been shot!" The wounded man on the floor raised himself on his elbow. "What are you doing?" he demanded in a startled way. "Are you mad? Thank your stars you were lucky enough to get out of this alive. And get out now, while you have the chance." Jimmie Dale pressed his hand firmly over the mouthpiece of the telephone. "I'll go," he said with a cold smile, "when I've settled with you for the murder of Henry LaSalle." "That man?" ejaculated the man scornfully, pointing to the form on the floor. "So that's your game! Going to try and cover your tracks! Why, you fool, I live here! Do you think the police would imagine for an instant that I killed him?" "I said Henry LaSalle," said Jimmie Dale evenly. The man came farther up on his elbow, a sudden look of fear in his face. What do you mean?" he cried hoarsely. But Jimmie Dale was talking again into the telephone, gasping, choking out his words as before. "Police headquarters. I'm Henry LaSalle, 5th Avenue. I've been shot. Take down this statement. I'll be dead before you get here. I'm not the real Henry LaSalle at all. We murdered Henry LaSalle in Australia and murdered Peter LaSalle here. We tried to kill the daughter, but she ran away. This house has been our headquarters for the last 5 years. The man who shot me tonight is the leader of the gang. We quarreled over the division of a hall. He's here on the floor now, wounded. Get them all. Get them all, damn them. Do you hear? Get them all. They're out of the house now, but lay a trap for them. They always come in through the garage on the side street. Oh God, I'm done for. Break down the west walls of the rooms upstairs if you want proof of what the gang has been doing. Hurry, hurry. I'm done for. Jimmie Dale permitted the telephone to drop with a clash from his hand to the table. The face of the man on the floor was livid. "Who are you? In God's name, who are you?" he cried out wildly. "Does it matter?" inquired Jimmie Dale grimly. "Your game is up. You will go to the chair for the murder of Henry LaSalle, if it is by proxy. Those rooms upstairs alone are enough to damn you, to prove every word of that dying confession. But tomorrow, added to it, will come the story of Marie LaSalle herself." For a moment the man hung there swaying on his elbow, his face working in ghastly fashion, and then, suddenly, with a strange laugh, he carried one hand swiftly to his mouth and laughed again, and before Jimmie Dale could reach him was lifeless on the floor. A tiny vial rolled away upon the carpet. Jimmie Dale picked it up. A drop or two of liquid still remained in it, colorless, clear, like that liquid this same man had dropped into the rabbit's mouth the night before, like the liquid in the glasses they had carried into that third room, like the liquid that this man had said was from a formula of their own, that was instantaneous in its action, that defied detection by autopsy. The set, stern features of Jimmie Dale relaxed. It was justice, but it was also death. In a surge of emotion, the events of scarcely more than 24 hours began to crowd upon him. And then, ominously dominant, above all else, that slogan of the underworld, "Death to the Gray Seal," came ringing once more in his ears. It brought him, with a startled movement of his hand across his eyes, to a realization of his own desperate position. Yes, yes, he must go. The way was clear now for the Tocsin, clear now for her. He dropped the vial into his pocket and, running to the safe, quickly scraped the gray seal from the dial's knob. Then he drew the packages of money from his shirt and pockets and tossed them on the floor among the litter of papers already there. She would get it back again when it had served its purpose. It would be self-evident that it was the proceeds of that day's sale of the estate's securities over which the quarrel had occurred. And now the window. He ran to it, closed it and locked it. Then, laying the revolver he had taken from the leader down beside the man, he stepped across the room again and drew the body of Henry LaSalle closer to the table, as though the man had fallen there when the telephone had dropped from his hand. It was done now. On the floor beside him lay each man's weapon, and both of the revolvers had been discharged several times. Jimmie Dale paused on the library threshold for a final survey of the room. It was done. The way was clear for her. And now, if he could only save himself. There was no chance for Larry the Bat. Could he save Jimmie Dale? He crossed the hall, a queer, half-grim, half-wistful smile on his lips, unlocked the front door, stepped out, locked it behind him, and in another moment, doubling around the corner, was running along like a hare along the side street. End of Part 2, Chapter 15 of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Read by Lars Rolander. Part 2, Chapter 16 of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Lars Rolander. Part 2. The Woman in the Case. Chapter 16. Death to the Gray Seal. On Jimmie Dale ran. Across on 4th Avenue he swung on a car that took him to Astor Place. Then, striking east once more, making a detour to avoid the Bowery, he ran on at top speed again. To reach the Sanctuary, not before the Magpie should have spread the alarm. That was impossible. But to reach it before the underworld should have had time to recover its breath, as it were, before the underworld should have had time to act. That was his only chance. The Magpie had, at the outside, a start of 15 minutes, but he, Jimmie Dale, had probably retrieved 5 minutes of that in the time he had made in getting downtown. That left the Magpie 10 to the good. How long would it take the Magpie to bring the underworld swarming like hornets around the Sanctuary? On Larry the Bat ran. At the Sanctuary were the clothes, the belongings of Jimmie Dale. Could he save Jimmie Dale? If he could get there, changed, and get out again, the way was clear for him. As clear as for the Tocsin now. In a few hours the police would have every member of the crime club in the trap. There would be no watch any more around his house on Riverside Drive, and he would be free to return there and resume his normal life as Jimmie Dale again, if he could make the Sanctuary in time. But let the Magpie get there first. Let the underworld tear the place to pieces in its fury as it would do. Let them discover that hiding place under the flooring, for instance, and the Gray Seal would not be merely Larry the Bat, but Jimmie Dale as well. And a cry escaped him even as he ran. It meant ruin, the disgrace of an honored name, death, crimes without number at his door. Crimes. The Gray Seal had never committed a crime, but the crimes attributed to the Gray Seal he could not disprove, not one of them. He had meant them to appear as crimes, and he had succeeded so well that the Gray Seal's name, execrated, was a synonym for the most callous, dangerous and unscrupulous criminal of the age. He was gasping for breath as finally, making for the side door, he darted into the alleyway that flanked the Sanctuary. What story would the Magpie tell? Not the truth, of course. That would let the Magpie in for what had happened that night, for the Magpie must be well aware that he had shot at least one of the two men in that room. But the truth wasn't necessary. It was foreign and had no bearing on the one outstanding fact. The Gray Seal was Larry the Bat. At the present moment the Magpie had a double incentive for getting the Gray Seal. The Gray Seal was the only one who could prove murder against him that night in the LaSalle mansion, and afterwards, when the police version of the affair was made public, the Magpie, to save himself, would be careful enough to do or say nothing to contradict Henry LaSalle's confession. Larry the Bat slipped in through the door, halted there, listened, and then began to mount the rickety stairs with his silent tread. At the top he paused again. Nothing, no sound. They were not here yet. So far he was in time. He stepped to the Sanctuary door, unlocked it, passed into the squalid, miserable room that had harbored him for so long as Larry the Bat, locked the door behind him, crossed quickly to the window to make sure that the shutters were closed, and then, for the first time, as the gray light streaked in through the interstices, he was conscious that it was already dawn. So much the more need for haste then. He whipped out his revolver and laid it at his hand on the dilapidated table. Then the flooring in the corner was up in an instant, and he began to strip off the rags of Larry the Bat. Boots, mismated socks, the torn, patched trousers, the greasy flannel shirt, the threadbare coat, the nondescript slouch hat were thrown in a pile on the floor, and with them, from their hiding place, the grease paints and heterogeneous collection of makeup accessories. This done, he began to slip on the clothes of Jimmie Dale, and when half dressed, turned to the table again to remove the characteristic grime, stain and paint of Larry the Bat from face, hands, wrists, throat and neck. This was a longer, more arduous task. He reached for the cracked pitcher to pour more water into the basin, and, snatching up his revolver instead, whirled to face the door. Someone was outside. He had caught the creak of a footstep upon the stairs. In a flash he was across the room and crouched by the door. Yes, the step was nearer now. At the head of the stairs, on the landing, his revolver lifted, holding a steady bead on the door panel, and then there came a low voice. "Jimmie, Jimmie, are you there? Quick, Jimmie, are you there?" The Tocsin! What was she doing here? Why had he not warned her up there on the avenue? Fool that he was, that of all places she was to keep away from here. She slipped into the room as he unlocked the door. "They're coming, Jimmie," she panted breathlessly. "There's not an instant to lose. Listen. When the Magpie ran from the house, I ran with him, but it—" She tried to smile. "It wasn't to obey you to run away. I had made up my mind I wouldn't do that. It was to find out from him what had happened. He told me you were the Gray Seal. He did not suspect me. He thinks you were no more than just Larry the Bat to me, as you were to everybody else. He went straight to Chicago Ike's gambling rooms and found the Skeeter's gang there. You know them, Red Mose, the Midget, Harv Toms, and the Skeeter. You remember your fight with them over old Luddy's diamonds? Well, they have not forgotten either. They are on their way here now. The news that you are the Gray Seal is traveling like lightning all through the underworld. There will be a mob here on the Skeeter's heels. So, Jimmie, quick, run! Run, half Larry the Bat, half Jimmie Dale, and run! In another 5 minutes, perhaps, yes, but there probably would not be 5 minutes. And she, if she were found here. Yes, he said quietly. I'll get away in a moment. You go at once. He was smiling at her reassuringly. I'll meet you at. She looked at him then for an instant, interrupting him quickly as she shook her head. I didn't notice, Jimmie. You cannot go like that, can you? It would be even worse than being caught as Larry the Bat. Hurry then. I'm not going without you. No, he said. Go now. Go at once, Marie, while you can. You have risked your life as it is to come here and tell me this. For God's sake, go now. The great brown eyes were smiling bravely through a sudden mist. She shook her head again. Not without you, Jimmie. It brought a fierce, wild throb of joy upon him, and then a cold, sickening fear. Listen, he cried out desperately. You must go now. You cannot take any chances now, Marie. Everything is right for you. That man who posed as your uncle is dead. The leader of the crime club is dead. Don't you understand what that means? You have only to be Marie LaSalle again and claim your own. I cannot tell you all now. There's no time. That house was the crime club itself. The police will get them all. Don't you see? Don't you see? Everything is clear for you now. And now go. Go. You must go. She was staring at him, a strange wonder in her face. Clear? All clear for me? I can go back to my own life again? It was as though she were whispering some amazing thing of unbelievable joy to herself. Yes, he cried out again. Yes, but go. Go, Marie. But now for answer, suddenly she reached out and took the key from the door and put it in the pocket of her dress. We will go together, Jimmie, or not at all, she said simply. We are wasting precious moments. Hurry and dress. He hesitated miserably. What could he do if she would not go? And it was true. The moments were flying. Better, rather than futile argument, to use them as she said. There was still a chance. Why not? 5 minutes. He could do better than that. He must do better than that. Without a word he ran back across the room. In frantic haste, from face, hands, wrists and neck came the stain. There was still time. She was standing there by the door, listening. She, the Tocsin, she whom he loved, she who all through the years that had gone had been so strangely elusive and yet so intimately a part of his life. She was standing there now, here with him, in peril with every second that passed. He had only to slip on his coat and vest now, and make a bundle of Larry the Bat's things on the floor so that he could carry them away to destroy them. He stooped to gather up the clothes and straightened suddenly and jumped toward the door again. "They are coming, Jimmie," she called in a low voice, but he had already heard them. The stairs were creaking loudly under the tread of many feet. He pushed the Tocsin hurriedly back against the wall at the side of the door. "Stand here," he said under his breath, "out of the line of fire. Don't move." There was a rush against the door, and then a voice growled, "Oh, cut that out. What do yous want to do? Scare him away by busting it? Pick the lock and we'll lay for him inside till he shows up." It was the Skeeter's voice, the Skeeter and his gang, the worst Apaches in the city of New York. Professional assassins, death contractors he had called them, and the lowest bidders. A man's life any time for $25. No, they were not likely to forget the affair of the pushcart man, to forget old Luddy and his diamonds, to forget the Gray Seal. And they were only the vanguard of what was to come. Someone was working at the lock now. There was one way to stop that. It would not take them long to find out that he was here once the door was opened. Better know it with the door shut. Jimmie Dale lifted his revolver coolly and fired through the panel. A burst of yells answered the shot, and among them, high above the others, the Magpie scream, "We got him! We got him! He's there now!" And then it seemed that pandemonium broke loose. There was a volley of shots, the bullets splintering through the door panels as from a machine gun, so fast they came, and then another rush against the door. Flat on the floor, but well back onto one side, Jimmie Dale fired steadily again and again. Came screams of pain, yells and oaths, and they fell back from the door. And now from above, from overhead, came tumult. Windows thrown up, the stamp of feet, cries of fright, and from the street a low, sullen roar. The underworld was gathering fast. Once more the rush upon the door, and Jimmie Dale, a grim, twisted smile upon his lips, emptied his revolver into the panels. Once more they fell back, and then there came the Skeeter's voice, snarling like an infuriated beast. "He'll get a lot of us like this. Cut it out. Besides, we'll have the bulls down here in a minute, and he's our meat, not theirs. They'd be too damned soft with him. They'd only send him to the chair. Use Chase upstairs, Mose, and pass the word to beat it. And beat it quick. We'll burn the skunk out, that's what. And the bulls can stand alongside and watch if they likes, but he's our meat." Jimmie Dale did not dare to look at the Tocsin's face. Mechanically he refilled the magazine of his automatic and lay there waiting. The roar from the street grew louder. They seemed to be fighting out there, as though an inadequate number of police were trying to disperse a mob and not succeeding. Pretty soon, with the riot call in, there would probably be a battle for the Gray Seal. Sublime irony. It was death at the hands of either one. Children whimpered on the stairs outside. Men swore. Women cried. Feet shuffled hurriedly by as the tenement emptied. Occasionally a pertinent invitation to him to remain where he was. There was a vicious rip through the panel, and the drumming whir of a bullet flying through the room, and then a curious, ominous crackling sound, and then the smell of smoke. Jimmie Dale stood up, his face drawn and haggard. The tenement would go like matchwood, burn like bonfire, with any kind of a start, and there was no doubt about the start. The Skeeter, the Magpie, and the rest would have seen that it had headway enough to serve their purpose before either firemen or police could thwart them. He, Jimmie Dale, could take his choice, walk out into the bullet, or stay there, and he smiled miserably as his eyes fell upon the pile of Larry the Bat's clothing on the floor. There was no longer need to worry about its destruction. The fire would take care of that only too well. And then a low, bitter cry came to his lips, and he clenched his hands. If it were only himself, only himself! He crossed to the Tocsin and caught her in his arms. "Oh, my God, Marie!" he faltered. The cape and hood had fallen from her, and with the hood had fallen the gray streaked hair of Silver Mag, and now, as she smiled at him, it was from a face that was very beautiful and very brave and very full of tenderness. And he held her there, and neither spoke. It seeped in under the threshold of the door. It came from everywhere, filling the room, the black, strangling smoke. Outside in the hall all was silence now, save for that crackle of flame that grew in volume, that came now in quick, sharp reports like revolver shots. From out in the street swelled a cry, "Death to the Gray Seal!" Then the clang of bells, the roar and rattle of fire apparatus, strident voices bellowing orders, and the crowd again, blood hungry. "Death to the Gray Seal!" There was a chance, just one, if the fire had no headway along the upper end of the landing, and if they had not thought to set a watch for him above. They, the Magpie, the Skeeter and his gang, must have been driven even out of the house now by the smoke and flame. "Give me the key. I'm going to open the door, Marie," he said quietly. "Cover your face with a handkerchief, anything, and run to the left, to the next flight of stairs. There are 2 flats above this. We'll make the roof if we can. Now, are you ready?" It was an instant before she answered, an instant in which she lifted her face to his and held his face between her two hands, and then, "I am ready, Jimmie." He flung open the door, his arms around her to help her forward, and instinctively, with a cry, fell back for a moment. With the inrush of the draught poured the smoke, and through it, lurid yellow, showed the flames leaping from the stairwell. And then all was blind madness. Together they ran. At the foot of the stairs she fell, recovered herself, staggered up another, and fell again. He caught her up in his arms and, staggering now as she had staggered, went on. His lungs seemed to be bursting. His limbs grew weak and trembled under him. He could not see or breathe. The nauseating fumes suffocated him, bringing an intolerable agony. He gained the first landing above. There was one more. If he could only rest here for a moment. Yes, that was it. Rest. It wasn't so bad here now. She stirred in his arms, struggled to her feet, and he was helping her on again, and up the next flight of stairs. And suddenly he found himself laughing in hysteria, for they were climbing a half-stair, half-ladder way at the end of the upper landing, and the open skylight was above them, and they were drinking in the pure, fresh air. And now they were out upon the roof, and the roar from the street was in their ears, like the roar of great waters from some canyon far below. Jimmie Dale tried to speak, and found his lips were cracked and dry. He wet them with his tongue. "Don't stand up. We'd be seen. Crawl," he mumbled hoarsely. It took a long time, over one roof and then another and yet another, and then through the skylight of a tenement whose occupants were either craning from the front windows or were on the street below. It was perhaps half an hour, and then they, too, were standing in the street, and all about them the crowd was shouting in wild excitement. Up the block inside the fire lines the sanctuary was blazing furiously, and now suddenly the walls seemed to bulge outward. It brought a yell from the crowd. "Death to the Gray Seal!" She pulled at his arm. "Let us get away. Let us get away, Jimmie," she whispered frantically. A strange smile was on Jimmie Dale's lips. "We're safe now, for always," he whispered back. "Look." The sanctuary wall bulged farther outward, seemed to hang an instant hesitant in midair, and fell with a mighty crash. The Gray Seal was dead. End of Part 2, Chapter 16. And end of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Read by Lars Rolander.